A boy has just arrived in the city of Solon, the place he intends to turn into the starting point of his new life. Before coming to this world, he ended up taking over the body of a young thief who had been beaten to death, only to later discover that the body's former owner was an illegitimate son of the powerful Orlando family. On top of that, after transmigrating, Richard awakens the most powerful lord system, something that begins to directly influence his plans from that point onward. Upon entering the city, Richard goes to meet Solon's lord, Count Augustus, who immediately gives him terrible news. His father, Calvin Orlando, died the previous week, and Wenger Orlando, his half-brother, has taken over as the family's new heir. Since Wenger has always considered him a nuisance, he is willing to pay 500 gold coins for Richard to permanently give up the Orlando surname and use the money to establish his own territory. Richard realizes this could be extremely useful for starting his new life, but he refuses the first offer. Instead, he makes a point of emphasizing the value and prestige of the Orlando name, using that very fact to squeeze out a better deal. With little choice, Augustus raises the amount to 1,000 gold coins and also offers interest-free loans on the condition that Richard purchase the supplies he needs within Solon. This time, he immediately accepts the agreement. With the money secured, Richard asks about a group of Highland barbarians who were recently taken to the Colosseum. Augustus understands that he intends to use slaves as soldiers and admits that the idea is not bad, but warns him that those barbarians are known for both their courage and their rebellious nature, so they will hardly be easy to control. To Richard, however, that is exactly why he wants them. Each slave costs 20 gold coins, allowing Richard to buy 50 of them with the money he received. Satisfied that the first part of his plan is working, he prepares to head to the star-studded Colosseum, accompanied by one of Augustus's subordinates, while the Count himself begins to realize that this young man is not as simple as he appears. Along the way, Richard starts humming a song from his previous life, and when his companion asks what he is singing, he simply replies that it is a song from his homeland. During the journey, Richard recalls everything that has happened since he took over that body. After the original Richard died, he received the Lord system and spent his days learning martial arts and combat techniques. At first, his intention was simply to earn a position as a knight, but Calvin surprised everyone by granting the Orlando name to an illegitimate son who had lived on the streets. This ended up placing Richard directly in the middle of the family's power struggles. Fortunately, he also managed to obtain authorization to expand and govern a territory, giving him the opportunity to escape before the other members of the Orlando family could eliminate him. Not long afterward, they arrive at the Colosseum. Richard immediately asks for the Highland barbarians who were recently captured and explains to the woman in charge that Count Augustus agreed to sell them to him while also supporting the formation of his army. His goal is to use these men to protect the territory he plans to build. Once she understands the true reason for his visit, the woman realizes that Richard is not there to watch the Colosseum fights, but to take another step toward establishing his own domain. The woman in charge of the Colosseum still tries to change his mind, warning him that those Highland barbarians have already knocked out several fighters with a single blow and caused enormous expenses because of the injuries they inflicted. She also makes it clear that with Richard's physique, he would hardly be able to take them away, because they could simply crush him and escape soon afterward. When she mentions that they even kill crocodiles for their meat, he sees that as another advantage and concludes that if they are truly that strong, they have an even better chance of meeting his expectations. Confident in the training he has accumulated over the past 3 years and the support of the Lord system, Richard decides to settle everything right then and there. Standing before the barbarians, he announces that he has purchased all of them from the Lord of Solon, but admits that none of them are likely willing to accept slavery without a fight. Because of that, he proposes a simple contest. If any one of them defeats him in hand-to-hand combat, that person will earn their freedom. But if they lose, they will have to fight for him. The proposal catches the group's attention, and Russell, one of the strongest among them, steps forward without hesitation. The woman in charge of the Colosseum panics when she realizes that he has chosen one of the most dangerous men there, someone who has already killed several slaves in the past. She begs the protagonist's companion to stop the boy. Even so, Augustus's subordinate refuses to interfere and simply watches. Her fear is that if the boy dies there, she will be doomed. The fight begins and Russell charges forward without the slightest mercy. Their heads collide, but Russell grabs the protagonist by the collar and slams him violently to the ground, making the spectators believe the fight is already over and that the aristocrat may not have even survived. The woman from the Colosseum panics, convinced that her arena will have to pay a terrible price for what has happened. To everyone's surprise, however, Richard gets back up almost immediately. He then calmly explains that he simply allowed Russell to make the first move so no one could later accuse him of bullying his opponent. Russell cannot understand how Richard is still unharmed, but Richard has already activated the system's power boost and begins to show the results of the training he has accumulated since gaining that ability. He provokes his opponent, saying that this time he is going to get serious. Russell charges at him, but the protagonist restrains him with ease. The barbarian is completely baffled by the defeat and immediately demands another fight. Richard agrees, and the exact same thing happens several times. After 10 consecutive defeats, even Russell's own companions tell him to stop insisting, acknowledging that he has already lost far too many times. Exhausted, Russell still tries to claim that he can keep going, but at that moment, the leader of the group finally steps in. Ordering the fight to stop, she moves to the front of the barbarians and decides to face Richard personally. The barbarian chief enters the arena and makes it clear that, if she wins, all of them must regain their freedom. Richard confirms that he will keep his word. With that settled, Gunther immediately charges at him, and her speed surprises Richard. However, in the middle of her attack, the Lord system identifies the barbarian woman as a special unit classified as a hero, marking the first time Richard has encountered someone of that type. The system window distracts him for an instant, giving Gunther the chance to land a hit and demonstrate strength far beyond that of the other barbarians. She leaps into the air and tries to attack from above, but the young man manages to dodge. Augustus's subordinate starts to worry because the woman is extremely powerful. The chief continues pressuring Richard and even uses a massive stone during the fight. The impact destroys part of the arena, making everyone believe Richard has been killed. The barbarians begin celebrating their freedom. However, he soon reappears almost completely unharmed, holding the enormous stone with just one hand. Gunther is surprised that he is fine, but finds it interesting and challenges him to continue the fight. The young man says that Gunther has excellent speed, strength, and far greater potential than he expected. However, she still does not have what it takes to defeat him. She charges again and uses a chain to bind Richard before slamming him into the ground. Gunther declares that she has won, but the protagonist considers the move clever since she used the stone to distract him and the chain to immobilize him. Even so, once again, it is not enough. Russell cannot believe what he is seeing because those chains are made from the finest iron by the best dwarven blacksmith and are normally used to restrain beasts. Gunther also cannot believe it since those same chains were what had kept her trapped in that miserable situation for several years. Yet this young man broke them as if they were nothing. Richard praises the girl once again, saying that she is fast, powerful, and has a well-developed strategy, making her truly suitable to become his subordinate. She realizes that, until now, she still has not seen the boy's true power, and even wonders whether he might be some kind of monster. Determined, Gunther says that, since they are already there, they should both give it everything they have, otherwise she will not submit to him. The protagonist agrees and points out that he removed her chains precisely so she could also fight at full strength. Now, the real battle is about to begin. Richard lands a punch on her and leaps into the air to attack from above, but Gunther manages to dodge. However, his speed is far superior, and before she can even react, the young man pins her to the ground. Gunther accepts her defeat and tells him to go ahead and do what he came there to do. Richard prepares to strike, but what he is actually aiming for are her shackles. He tells her that she now has two choices. First, Gunther can keep challenging him alongside the other barbarians until every single one of them is defeated, or the entire group can follow him and grow stronger by his side. After personally experiencing the difference between their strength, the chief makes her decision and orders all the barbarians to recognize Richard as their new leader. Richard finally reveals his full name, Richard Orlando, and declares that he intends to become the most powerful lord, inviting everyone to grow stronger alongside him. Gunther and the other barbarians immediately accept and begin recognizing him as their leader, much to the surprise of the woman in charge of the Colosseum. Even Augustus's subordinate understands why Calvin Orlando decided to grant that young man the family name. Soon afterward, the Lord system registers Gunther's request and those of the Highland barbarian soldiers to join Richard's group. With his first subordinates finally secured, he accepts every request. This is a brutal and chaotic world where countless ambitious people try to seize land and become feudal lords on their own. However, most of them fail and die before they can build anything at all. Richard, on the other hand, is excited to finally head toward his territory. After gaining the support of Gunther and the 50 Highland barbarians, he considers this the first step toward beginning his new life as a lord. Before leaving, however, he still needs to equip all those men. Richard takes the group to a shop in the city, where the barbarians begin looking through clothes and equipment, while Gunther tries to stop some of them from choosing items that would not even fit. The shop belongs to a gnome named Negan, who welcomes Richard and claims to have some of the best goods in the region. Richard explains that he's looking for suitable equipment for his new companions, and when Negan hears that he wants good weapons, he reveals a hidden section of the shop by making one of the walls rotate, exposing a large arsenal. Richard decides to buy each of the 50 barbarians one spear and 3 javelins. However, Negan calculates that those weapons alone would cost 750 gold coins. But the young man tosses a few coins onto the counter and explains that this is all he has. Once it becomes clear that Richard cannot afford much more, the gnome's attitude changes completely, and he makes it clear that he does not sell on credit to customers without money. Richard takes out a sword he carries and offers it as part of the payment. The moment Negan recognizes the Dragon Vorpal sword, he is shocked to discover that it is a legendary weapon he has never seen in person before. This also makes the gnome conclude that Richard must come from a far more important background than he appears to, and that it would be best not to offend him. Instead of accepting the sword as payment, Negan suggests that Richard keep using such a valuable weapon, and agrees to put the remaining cost of the purchase on his tab. Taking advantage of the merchant's change in attitude, Richard increases the order, and decides that everyone should receive 1 spear, 3 javelins, and a set of leather armor as well. Negan realizes too late that he has agreed to far more than he intended, but even so, he orders all the equipment to be prepared. The barbarians celebrate, pleased with the way their new leader is taking care of them. With everyone properly armed, Gunther asks what their next move will be. Richard replies that now it is time to conquer the territory that will belong to them. The group leaves the city carrying their new supplies and travels across a vast, nearly deserted region. As Richard and his men advance, however, other forces have already noticed the arrival of the caravan. Hansen, the goblin chief, celebrates when he sees that after such a long time without merchants or administrators passing through the area, new prey has finally appeared carrying a large amount of supplies. Beside him, Jackal, the werewolf chief, immediately demands at least half of the weapons they managed to steal. Hansen tries to restrain his eagerness and suggests waiting for the right moment. In his view, once those travelers move deeper into the region, they will have nowhere left to run and no one to ask for help. The werewolf becomes excited when he sees that Richard's group appears to be at a clear numerical disadvantage and wants to attack immediately. Not long afterward, Gunther notices that they are being followed and warns Richard that a band of raiders is on their trail. Richard had already noticed them and immediately begins organizing everyone for the confrontation. He orders the group to stop, surround the wagon, and prepare for battle, using the supplies and animals as part of their defensive formation. He then calls Gunther and the others closer and gives each of them a small item, telling them to swallow it before the fight. Richard claims that it is a kind of Eastern pill capable of strengthening the body and improving combat performance. Some of the barbarians are suspicious, unsure whether something like that really exists, but he responds casually as though there is no reason for him to lie. In truth, Richard knows perfectly well that he is deceiving his own subordinates. Those little pellets are merely a disguise meant to hide how the Lord system actually works. While keeping up appearances, Richard accesses the system and examines the condition of his men. He confirms that most of the Highland barbarians are classified as level 3 spearmen, though there are also other variations among them, such as warriors, hunters, and axe guards. Gunther, meanwhile, is treated by the system as an independent hero-type unit, separate from ordinary soldiers. Richard then realizes that by winning battles, his subordinates will be able to accumulate experience and level up, becoming stronger and stronger. That is exactly why he decides to use the fake pills as an excuse, so no one will become too suspicious about the sudden increase in strength that the system may provide. On the other side, the pursuers notice that the group has stopped and interpret it in the worst possible way. The werewolves believe the time has come to slaughter their prey, while the goblins conclude that Richard and his men must have become terrified and decided to surrender. Even so, they show no interest in accepting any surrender and charge forward, determined to kill everyone and seize the weapons and supplies. Seeing the enemies approach, Richard finally gives the order to begin the fight. Jackal and the other bandits charge in, crazed by the chance to loot brand new weapons, while goblins and orcs join the assault. At the same time, Richard readies his spear and throws it toward the enemy. Richard's spear cuts across the battlefield at high speed toward Hansen, but he blocks it with ease and remains confident. To the goblin chief, that display of strength changes nothing, since his army still holds an overwhelming numerical advantage. He orders everyone to advance at once, and the barbarians begin to worry when they realize they are being surrounded from all sides. Gunther asks what they should do, and Richard simply asks for another spear. She tries to warn him that he will not be able to defeat so many enemies just by throwing weapons, but that was never his goal. Richard explains that he does not need to eliminate everyone, only the right targets. He strikes the spear against the roof of the wagon and sets its tip on fire. He then identifies one of the largest creatures in the enemy army and throws the weapon again, killing the massive troll with a single attack. The fall of that creature immediately changes the mood of the battlefield. The enemies begin to hesitate while the barbarians realize that the horde is not as terrifying as it first seemed and regain the courage to counterattack. In the middle of the chaos, Jackal tries to exploit an opening and strike one of Richard's men, but before he can complete the attack, Richard intervenes and saves his subordinate. Right afterward, he announces that one of the enemy leaders has already fallen and orders his men to take advantage of the moment and quickly finish off the disorganized opponents. Gunther finally understands Richard's strategy. From the very beginning, he climbed onto the wagon specifically so he could observe the entire battlefield and locate the ones commanding the attack. Instead of wasting strength fighting hundreds of enemies, his plan is to eliminate the leaders first and destroy the group's organization. After studying the battle, Richard realizes that only one truly important target remains. Hansen watches his men being defeated and scorns them for panicking before a single human, but Richard has already arrived in front of him. After confirming that he is speaking to the Goblin Chief, Richard asks whether Hansen was the one who organized the ambush, and even questions whether he is not afraid of attracting the attention of other powerful forces in the region. Convinced that he still has the advantage, Hansen ends up revealing more than he should. He explains that the nearest force is based at High Mountain Fortress, a few kilometers to the east, a position that is easy to defend and difficult to attack. According to him, however, the kobolds living there are too cowardly to leave their fortress and try to steal his spoils. Richard calmly thanks him for the information because Hansen has just given him exactly what he needed to choose his next destination. Since the goblin failed to get his hands on the supplies he wanted, Richard decides to offer him something else instead. He draws Wormslayer and charges at the chief, finishing Hansen before he can react. Seeing their leader dead, the goblins fall into panic and begin treating Richard like a true monster. Gunther takes advantage of the complete collapse in enemy morale and orders the barbarians to finish the job. With the victory, the effects of the Lord system finally begin to appear. Some of the barbarian spearmen level up, advancing from level 3 to level 4 and realize that their bodies have genuinely become stronger. Unaware of the truth about the system, they immediately attribute the change to the supposed pills Richard gave them before the battle, exactly as he had planned. After defeating the bandits, the men begin collecting the equipment and belongings left behind, realizing they can make a good amount of money from the loot. They also manage to capture 2 trolls alive and ask whether they should kill them. Richard decides to spare them, since one of the horses was lost during the battle, and plans to use the 2 creatures to pull their cargo from then on. Finally, Gunther finds a map among the Goblin Chief's belongings and hands it to Richard. With the new information and the route now in his hands, he immediately sets the group's next objective, High Mountain Fortress. With the 2 trolls pulling the wagon, the group moves at an excellent pace, and Richard estimates that it will not take them long to reach High Mountain Fortress. Along the way, he takes the opportunity to examine the Lord system more closely, and realizes that every time he levels up, he receives free points to distribute among his own attributes. The shop function remains locked, so Richard decides to invest his available points in strength and throwing. He also discovers that his weapon proficiency does not depend solely on those points and can improve naturally through real combat. However, the attributes he can develop are limited by his innate talent, and since he has no aptitude for magic whatsoever, his path is focused mainly on physical combat. After so many improvements, Richard realizes that he already possesses roughly 10 times the strength of an ordinary person, and even starts wondering how far he might go if he continues growing at this rate. Not long afterward, Gunther announces that they have finally reached the foot of High Mountain Fortress. Richard surveys the area and is pleased to find a highly favorable environment with vegetation, water, and natural resources nearby. The barbarians also enjoy the stop, happy to finally be far away from the Colosseum. Some of them quickly hunt animals to prepare food, showing Richard that they possess excellent survival skills. Seeing that his men have spent the past several days traveling and fighting, Richard allows them to rest for a while before the attack. He notices Gunther sniffing herself and points her toward a small hidden lake where she can bathe in peace, assuring her that he will keep the others away. With that, she takes her bath without being disturbed. Once everyone has recovered their strength, Richard gathers the group and announces that it is time to take the fortress. As they approach, he confirms that the place is occupied by the kobolds Hansen mentioned. Since the guards do not seem to pose much of a threat, the barbarians believe they could simply storm the place and wipe them out, but Richard prefers to act quickly and strike from within before they can organize a defense. Inside the fortress, 2 kobolds are fooling around when the group suddenly kicks the door open, catching everyone completely off guard. While the kobolds begin shouting about the invasion and trying to rally their men, the barbarians have already advanced outside and quickly eliminated all external resistance. Despite being at a disadvantage, the kobold leader tries to intimidate Richard, claiming that he has more than a dozen allies scattered throughout the region and that they will certainly avenge anything that happens to him. The threat, however, impresses no one. Before long, the kobold completely abandons his arrogance and starts apologizing. Satisfied that the leader has finally understood his position, Richard orders him released. Gunther finds Richard's decision strange and asks whether he truly intends to set the kobold leader free. Richard confirms without hesitation, and she cuts his restraints before driving him out of the fortress. The kobold immediately flees, deeply humiliated and swearing to himself that this will not be the end of it. Meanwhile, the barbarians are still surprised by how easily they captured High Mountain Fortress. Gunther even considers the kobolds completely useless, but Richard has already begun examining the place from a different perspective. After inspecting the entire structure, he realizes that there is more than enough space to establish his territory. The fortress also has complete facilities, an elevated position, and an excellent view of the surrounding area, allowing them to see for several kilometers in every direction. With their base practically secured, Richard gathers everyone for the first combat meeting of his new territory. Some of the barbarians are surprised that they may have to fight again so soon, but he explains that High Mountain Fortress is an extremely advantageous position. It sits on elevated ground, is easy to defend, difficult to attack, and has abundant sources of water nearby. However, the very fact that such an excellent location was controlled by relatively weak kobolds makes Richard believe that the captured leader was probably telling the truth when he claimed to have several companions and troops scattered throughout the region. One of the barbarians then notices the problem and asks whether freeing him was not the same as allowing the enemy to return with reinforcements. But that is exactly Richard's objective. After spending most of his money equipping the barbarians with weapons and armor, he intends to use the upcoming battles to increase his forces and gather more resources. Rather than wasting time searching for each group of kobolds separately, it is far more convenient to make all of them come to him. Richard then makes it clear that he did not release that leader out of mercy. He deliberately let a single enemy escape so he could use him as bait and draw all the others in at once. Several days pass after Richard releases the kobold leader to attract reinforcements, but no enemies appear. While the group enjoys their food and settles more comfortably into the fortress, Gunther begins losing patience with the delay. Richard, however, prefers to wait, knowing that acting too hastily could ruin his plan. Before long, one of the barbarians returns with news that enemy troops have finally set up camp not far away and appear to be preparing for a surprise attack. Hearing this, Richard realizes that his bait has worked and immediately orders everyone to prepare. During the night, he observes the enemy camp and is surprised to see that those goblins have actually fallen asleep while supposedly planning an ambush. Richard concludes that they must be the reinforcements summoned by the kobold he released, and decides to use this opportunity to solidify his position in the High Mountain Fortress region once and for all. To avoid leaving his new base undefended, Richard takes only Gunther and part of the barbarian force with him, while the rest remain at the fortress with the trolls. His goal is to eliminate the enemy group quickly before they have a chance to react. The raid on the camp begins as a complete surprise. Gunther opens one of the tents and immediately kills a goblin, while the barbarians rush the others before they can organize themselves. During the attack, Richard notices an important difference in his men. Before, the Highland barbarians mainly relied on their overwhelming individual abilities and had very little coordination with one another, a result of their lack of proper training. After all, possessing strength alone does not make someone a true soldier. Now, however, Gunther is able to keep them in formation and lead the assault in an organized manner. Richard realizes that the Lord system has not only increased his subordinates' attributes, but has also gradually transformed them into troops capable of fighting as a coordinated unit. Because of this, the ordinary goblins are quickly overwhelmed, and the barbarians begin to believe the battle is already practically decided. However, in the middle of the fighting, the ground suddenly starts shaking. A massive creature appears before them, immediately drawing the group's attention. The barbarians identify the enemy as a Draco Goblin, a type of goblin with dragon blood and a body far larger and more powerful than those of ordinary goblins. Before they can deal with that threat, more enemies begin emerging from underground all around the battlefield. What appeared to be nothing more than a small goblin camp quickly turns into a battle against a much larger force, leaving the barbarians shocked by the number of enemies that had been hiding there. Gunther immediately realizes that the Draco Goblin is different from the enemies they faced before, and warns Richard to be careful. However, their opponent still has another surprise waiting. He summons a massive underground creature that tears through the ground and emerges before the barbarians with an enormous body covered in tough scales. Confident in his power, the Draco Goblin looks down on the invaders and declares that the power of dragon blood will be more than enough to destroy them all. Gunther wastes no time and charges at the creature, but her attack cannot penetrate its scales. The Draco Goblin mocks her, claiming that such a simple spear could never wound his beast, while once again boasting about the superiority of his dragon blood. Before Gunther can put herself in any more danger, Richard joins the fight. He charges directly at the monster and instead of trying to pierce its scales, relies on sheer physical strength to overpower it. Richard grabs the enormous creature and violently slams it into the ground, neutralizing the very beast the Draco Goblin had treated as his greatest trump card. The result sends even the goblins into a panic. The barbarians are equally stunned, unable to understand just how far Richard's strength truly goes, while the Draco Goblin himself refuses to believe that his creature was defeated so easily. Richard then turns his attention to him and mocks all that talk about supposedly noble dragon blood, making it clear that at that moment, the one in a position to surrender is the Draco Goblin himself. Even in the face of such a huge difference in strength, the enemy still refuses to accept defeat and insists that he will never submit. Richard responds by defeating the goblin. With the Draco Goblin finally beaten, Richard simply confirms what he had said from the beginning. He intended to turn that fight into a quick battle. Afterward, Richard checks the rewards granted by the system. In addition to experience, some of his spearmen evolve into level 4 warriors, while Gunther reaches level 2 and receives an additional attribute point. Without giving it much thought, Richard invests the point directly into her strength. Soon afterward, Gunther and the other barbarians bring over everything they managed to loot from the enemies. However, when they open one of the chests, they discover that the goblins were practically as poor as they were, leaving behind only 2 gold coins. Richard even concludes that those enemies probably were not doing very well either. Among the spoils is the massive scaled creature used by the Draco Goblin. Gunther asks what they should do with it, and Richard decides to spare it. First, he threatens to turn it into food if it refuses to obey, then decides to use it as a mount and names it Wind Chaser. Before returning to the fortress, Richard takes the opportunity to access the system shop, which has finally become available. Since he has spent nearly all the money he had, he chooses one of the cheapest options and buys a new spear. As soon as the purchase is completed, the weapon appears directly in his hands. Gunther assumes it is some kind of spatial magic, while Richard gains a better understanding of how products purchased through the system are delivered. At that moment, the group notices some movement not far away. From atop Wind Chaser, Richard surveys the area and spots a group of jackals attacking a large caravan loaded with goods and animals. Judging by the amount of supplies, it is obvious that the travelers have considerable wealth, which explains why they attracted the bandits. Gunther asks whether they intend to get involved, and Richard begins analyzing the situation. That caravan seems far beyond an ordinary group of merchants, and since he has only just established his own territory, he knows that building trade relations will be extremely important for its development. If he helps those people now, they may open business opportunities for him in the future. The jackals surround the caravan and demand that the merchants hand over all their money, claiming that they are crossing through their territory. However, the man in charge of the caravan reveals that they belong to the Voya Trading Company and tries to drive the bandits away by warning them that if anything happens to them, even the Imperial Army will not let it go. The jackals are not intimidated even after learning that the caravan belongs to the Pompeii Empire. As bandits, they do not care about threats involving the Imperial Army and launch their attack. The merchants panic, and the old man even offers all their money in exchange for their lives, but the jackal leader makes it clear that it is already too late to beg. Before the strike can land, a spear flies across the field and hits the attacker, saving the merchant. Richard watches with satisfaction as his newly purchased weapon performs extremely well, while Gunther immediately orders the barbarians to advance and eliminate the bandits. This time, Richard decides not to participate directly and simply watches how his men perform. The jackals are strong enough to threaten an ordinary caravan, but they are nothing more than a disorganized mob before the barbarian. Richard acknowledges that the barbarians have always possessed great individual strength, but now they are also acquiring what he considers even more important for surviving in that region: discipline. The difference compared to the disorganized group he found at the Colosseum is enormous, and this time they managed to overpower the jackals without relying on their leader's intervention. In the middle of the battle, some of the bandits try to flee, but they quickly realize who they are dealing with. Richard's reputation has already begun spreading throughout the region, and they recognize his men as the group responsible for defeating the alliance of goblins, trolls, and jackals, as well as easily taking the kobolds' territory. With that, they also identify Richard as the mysterious noble lord who recently appeared in the wilderness. Fear overwhelms the jackals, who abandon any intention of fighting and try to escape. However, it is already too late. The protagonist's pet finishes off the remaining enemies without Richard having to lift a finger. Richard realizes that his army is no longer the confused and scattered force it once was, until one of his men announces that he has killed the final jackal. With the threat eliminated, the members of the caravan approach to thank them. One of the merchants even promises to tell everyone about the help they received, but Richard shows little interest in praise and makes it clear that if they truly want to reward him, money would be far more useful. The response catches the merchant off guard and draws the attention of an elven woman traveling with the caravan. Watching Richard from a distance, she concludes that he truly fits the image of a greedy noble, but at the same time begins to find him quite interesting. The woman from the caravan introduces herself as Annie, a representative of the Voya Trading Company, and first confirms that Ruto is all right after the attack. She then thanks Richard and his men for rescuing them. Richard takes the opportunity to praise the courage of his barbarians, causing some of them to find the compliment strange since he normally does not treat them that way. Annie then explains that she needs one more favor. The caravan suffered heavy losses during the jackal attack, with several men killed or injured, and in their current condition they cannot continue their trading journey. Because of that, she asks for permission to remain in Richard's territory for some time until reinforcements arrive. Richard agrees to consider the proposal, but immediately makes it clear that staying in his territory will not be free. Annie does not mind and offers money and weapons as payment. She then asks Ruto to bring over a special crystal and demonstrates how it works. Once activated, the object expands in size and allows her to send a message directly to the trading company's headquarters requesting help. Annie estimates that the reinforcements will take at least 3 days to arrive, since they are very far from the city of Corin. Seeing that the caravan even possesses a communication crystal, Richard confirms that he is not dealing with ordinary merchants. He begins to see a valuable opportunity for the future of his territory and agrees to host the group at High Mountain Fortress, officially introducing himself as the lord of the area. After they arrive at the fortress, Annie immediately begins tending to the survivors and orders Ruto to distribute a potion among the injured soldiers. Richard identifies the item through the system and discovers that it is a powerful healing potion. Seeing its value makes him even more convinced that the Voya Trading Company has considerable resources. Later, Annie asks about the caravan's losses. Ruto explains that the merchandise and goods remained almost entirely intact, but around half of their men were either killed or wounded. In his opinion, if Richard had not appeared at that moment, the consequences would have been far worse. When Annie asks what he thinks of Richard, Ruto admits that the young man truly seems to be an excellent lord. He recalls that during the ambush, the caravan was already in a desperate situation, but the arrival of Richard's men completely turned the battle around. Ruto also acknowledges that the barbarians are extremely strong and believes that even the caravan's own mercenaries would have difficulty fighting them. Meanwhile, Richard examines the merchant's equipment and realizes that Voya's soldiers appear much better equipped than his own men. Even so, the battle ends up being quite profitable for him. In addition to obtaining more armor without having to pay for it, the system also rewards him with Fred's battle axe, while his own soldiers continue improving through combat. The peace, however, does not last long. Gunther rushes in and warns him that she has just spotted another group approaching the fortress. This time, they are not goblins or jackals, but a large armed force made up of creatures with human upper bodies and horse-like lower bodies. Hearing the description, Richard realizes that a new group of visitors is now heading directly toward his territory. During the night, a large force of centaurs approaches High Mountain Fortress led by Hut, the chief of their clan. Not knowing their intentions, Richard tries to prevent them from advancing any farther by throwing his weapons as a warning. Hut is impressed by the accuracy of his throws, but initially orders her men to keep moving forward. Richard continues throwing his weapons closer and closer to them, making it clear that he will not allow them to enter his territory freely. Realizing that continuing forward would be far too dangerous, Hut finally orders everyone to stop. Gunther immediately recognizes that the centaur woman seems quite powerful, but notices that the group no longer appears to have any intention of attacking. Even so, Richard decides to go meet them, keeping his men on alert since he still does not know the reason for their visit. Faced with the centaurs, Richard demands an explanation, and Hut introduces herself as the leader of her clan, assuring him that she has come with peaceful intentions. Richard also introduces himself as the Lord of High Mountain Fortress, only to discover that his reputation has already spread quite far throughout the wilderness. Hut has even heard stories about the supposedly invincible Richard from the southern province, although he does not place much importance on that reputation. She then reveals the true reason for her visit and hands Richard a letter. Since he cannot understand what is written, she explains that the native peoples of the region are gathering soldiers. High Mountain Fortress originally belonged to the natives of Kotu, and now they intend to raise an army to reclaim it. Gunther adds that these peoples have always harbored hostility toward Pompeii, making it obvious that Richard has become one of their main targets. Hut also warns that the natives have the support of a shaman, and that their strength should not be underestimated. Despite the threat, the centaurs have not come to join that army. Hut explains that her clan was once part of the old Orc kingdom and has no intention of abandoning its stable way of life to become a band of raiders. The centaurs have preserved their own culture, including art, a calendar, and poetry, and are now seeking the support of a powerful lord who can help them restore the former glory of their people. Richard realizes that their visit may turn out to be far more advantageous than he expected. The Lord system confirms that the centaurs can be incorporated into his forces and identifies Hut as a hero-type unit skilled with the longbow and heavy sword, although she has a weakness to fire. More importantly, Richard sees in them exactly what his army still lacks: soldiers capable of fighting effectively at long range. After welcoming Hut, Richard gathers the others and introduces the centaur leader, but warns them that she has brought troubling news. He explains that the natives of Kotu, together with other forces in the region, including jackals, are preparing a new war against the fortress. Annie asks when this will happen, and the protagonist believes it will take at least 10 days. Hud explains that although the enemy is already assembling an army, the alliance is made up of several different factions. They still need to gather troops, assign roles, and prepare supplies before marching, so it will probably take at least 10 days for them to reach High Mountain Fortress. Richard looks at the situation differently. No matter how large the enemy force may be, 10 days is enough time to prepare. Now that he knows about the threat in advance and has received the support of the centaurs at exactly the right moment, Richard begins planning how he will face the army coming to reclaim his new base. Gunther and Annie ask whether Richard already has a way to deal with the approaching army, but he prefers not to reveal his plans yet. Instead, he goes to Annie with a request directly related to the preparations. He needs to borrow another 500 gold coins from the Voya Trading Company. Since Richard has just saved her caravan and is now providing shelter for the group, Annie agrees without hesitation and assures him that she can provide the money immediately. With the resources secured, Richard turns his attention back to Hut and confirms that the centaurs truly specialize in archery. Their leader herself states that her people are among the finest archers, exactly what Richard needs to make up for the lack of long-range troops in his army. However, strengthening his men even further through the system costs money. So much of the newly acquired gold already has a purpose. Richard accesses the shop and buys a purple longbow along with white feathered arrows. As soon as the weapons appear in his hands, Hut is once again puzzled by his ability to make objects appear out of nowhere, and even asks whether he knows magic. Richard simply dismisses it as a small trick and hands her the equipment so she can try it out. Hut immediately tests the new bow and demonstrates the full skill of her clan, firing with impressive accuracy, even from long range. Richard is satisfied with the result since the centaurs can now take on the role of archers and significantly increase the fortress's ranged firepower. Hut is also pleased to finally be using quality equipment again, and Richard orders her clan to begin serious training for the coming battle starting the next day. However, before they can continue with their preparations, Rudo comes running with more troubling news. The reinforcements sent by the Voya Trading Company have finally been found, but they were apparently attacked along the way. Hearing this, Richard immediately decides to investigate what happened. Annie is furious when she finds the Voya Trading Company's reinforcements completely wiped out. When Richard arrives and asks what happened, she confirms that nearly all the men sent to help them were killed. With the area around High Mountain Fortress becoming increasingly dangerous, Richard suggests that Annie gather the mercenaries who are still healthy and return to the city of Solon. Since with good horses and men still capable of fighting, they should be able to protect themselves during the journey. Annie, however, refuses to abandon the wounded who fought for her up to that point. Since she intends to remain at the fortress even with a war approaching, Richard takes advantage of the situation and warns her that staying there will now cost more. To compensate for the risk and expenses, he proposes using the previously agreed 2,000 gold coins as payment, and Annie eventually accepts. While examining the bodies and equipment found at the site, Hut notices that one of the enemy spears is rather crudely made and even carries a strong scent of pine wood. Richard examines the spearhead and concludes that the iron appears to have been produced by the attackers themselves. This surprises him, since he did not expect people from such a wild region to be capable of mining and working ore on their own. Annie then explains that Richard is still greatly underestimating the size and strength of the wilderness. Farther north, there are enormous tribes, some of which function almost like small independent kingdoms, with thousands of adult warriors and the ability to manufacture their own weapons. These large peoples are constantly fighting over territory and influence, so developing weapons to strengthen their armies is completely normal for them. Their strength is also far beyond that of the small groups Richard has faced since arriving in the region. Hearing this, Hut realizes that those responsible for attacking the caravan were probably natives of Bingyuan. Annie agrees and points out that the natives of Kotu are already gathering forces to reclaim High Mountain Fortress, so the presence of Bingyuan forces in the region is unlikely to be a coincidence. Richard reaches the same conclusion and understands that they probably came specifically to take part in the war that is forming. Gunther reacts confidently and declares that if those enemies show up, she will crush every last one of them herself. Richard appreciates her spirit, but he would rather eliminate the threat all at once by gathering the enemies together and defeating them in a single confrontation. The following days are spent preparing for battle. 10 days later, one of the scouts finally returns with the news Richard has been waiting for. The enemy army has been located camping at the foot of a mountain about 50 miles away, and judging by the speed of their march, they should reach High Mountain Fortress by the following day. After waiting and preparing for so long, Richard finally receives confirmation that the great battle is about to begin. When the enemy army finally approaches High Mountain Fortress, Richard gathers his men and fires up their morale, making it clear that this is the moment to go out and fight and tear off the enemy's heads without mercy. His soldiers immediately respond to the provocation with battle cries, ready to slaughter the enemy. Even though he is already fully equipped for battle, Richard still finds the weight of his armor unfamiliar, but it does nothing to diminish his confidence. Annie then asks exactly what the plan is and how her group should cooperate. Richard gives a simple and direct answer. First, a heavy rain of arrows. After that, everyone charges at once. In his view, all they need to do is take down a significant portion of the enemy force for the rest to collapse. Annie and Rudo are clearly uneasy, since the opposing side has somewhere around 500 or 600 men, several times more than the forces defending the fortress. But Richard remains calm and tells them not to worry. On the other side, the invaders also notice that the defenders are far fewer in number and begin treating them as though they are already doomed. Even so, some warn that the Pompeian leader is dangerous and should not be underestimated. Despite that warning, the assembled army remains highly confident and decides to crush the fortress in one decisive attack. Richard, meanwhile, simply remarks that those men were lucky enough to live well until now but failed to appreciate it, and then gives the order to begin the battle. The first move comes from the centaurs. Under Hutt's command, they unleash a rain of arrows that falls over the enemy lines and immediately causes casualties at the very start of the confrontation. Richard's soldiers take advantage of the opening to keep up the pressure while the opposing side tries to answer with projectiles of their own. Even so, the battlefield is already beginning to tilt in the fortress's favor. As the clash between the two armies intensifies, Richard decides to put even more pressure on the enemy and calls Windchaser into action. He orders his mount to show what it can do, and the creature charges brutally into the enemy formation, tearing open a path across the battlefield and making the fortress's offensive even harder to contain. High Mountain Fortress continues its relentless assault, with the barbarians advancing without giving the enemy any chance to recover, cutting them down one after another while Gunther orders everyone to kill them all and let no one escape. In the middle of the chaos, Richard keeps attacking from atop Windchaser, using his spear to tear through the enemy lines and bring down several warriors in succession. Even so, he realizes that the opponents gathered on this battlefield are not weak, and acknowledges that he is facing enemies far tougher than those from before. On the enemy side, the situation begins spiraling out of control. Realizing that brute force alone will not be enough, they turn to the shaman and demand that she cast her magic immediately, while the dogmen also pressure her to use the spell as quickly as possible. Soon afterward, the ritual is activated and an enormous fireball begins forming and advancing across the battlefield. Richard immediately realizes that it must be the shaman's magic and warns everyone to be careful. The attack races across the field and explodes with tremendous power, making it clear that the enemy's magic is a genuine threat. For the first time since arriving in the wilderness, Richard is actually injured. He acknowledges that the shaman's spells are far more powerful than he expected, and quickly tries to figure out how to neutralize her. Watching her movements, he notices that she seems to use her staff to control the flames. At that moment, Hutt arrives to check whether Richard is all right, and he immediately decides to make use of the centaur's abilities to put his plan into action. Richard asks whether she can hit the shaman from that distance, and Hutt assures him that it will not be a problem. She immediately organizes her archers and orders a continuous barrage against the enemy position. A true rain of arrows falls across the battlefield, forcing the opponents to focus on protecting the shaman. Richard takes advantage of the opening and launches a surprise attack while the enemies are busy preventing the arrows from reaching her. Amid the confusion, her control over the spell is disrupted, and the massive fireball collapses, scattering flames across her own troops. The result is exactly what Richard wanted. Part of the enemy army is struck by its own attack, turning the shaman's magic into a problem for her own allies. With the enemy formation thrown into even greater disarray, Richard decides that the time has come to finish off the remaining resistance. Before the battle can end, however, the shaman resorts to another ability. Purple energy begins surrounding several fighters, and Richard realizes that she is using some kind of blood magic to strengthen them or keep them fighting. Even so, it is no longer enough to change the course of the battle. Richard charges into the remaining enemies while Gunther moves to the front line and eliminates anyone who still tries to resist. The opposing forces are surrounded and begin falling one after another, until even their leaders realize that the battle is lost. Some still try to flee, but Richard has no intention of letting anyone escape after finally managing to surround them. After knocking her down and capturing her, Richard finally gets a proper look at the person behind all that magic and is surprised to discover that the feared shaman is actually a young witch. After the battle, Richard notices that Nat has been seriously wounded and asks Gunther about his condition. She confirms that the injury is severe and that they urgently need a doctor. Since no one is available to treat an injury of that level, Richard immediately turns his attention to the young shaman he has just captured. The girl complains about the way she is being treated and reveals that her name is Model, also claiming that she only participated in the battle because she was forced to. Richard, however, shows little patience and demands that she use her abilities to save Nat, especially after her magic caused so many deaths on the battlefield. Faced with Richard's threat, Model eventually gives in and agrees to help. She begins using her magic on Nat's wound, and to everyone's surprise, the injury completely disappears within a short time, leaving the barbarians amazed by the girl's abilities. Model finishes the treatment visibly exhausted, while Richard realizes that she is not only powerful with offensive spells, but also possesses an extremely useful healing ability. Because of this, he concludes that keeping her at High Mountain Fortress could bring enormous benefits. With Nat's condition resolved, Gunther asks what they should do with the goblins, dogmen, and other enemies who survived the battle. Richard orders some of his men to clean up the battlefield and commands that all survivors be captured and taken away as slaves. His subordinates also begin collecting everything the enemies left behind, obtaining a large amount of loot. Soon afterward, the Lord system begins registering the results of the battle. Russell evolves into a Class 1 Giant Axe Warrior and receives new attribute points, while Nat and Lippy also level up, along with numerous other rewards and notifications involving experience and resources. The messages appear so quickly that Richard can barely keep track of them all. After sorting through the rewards, Gunther asks what they should do with Modal. Richard decides to bring her, along with the captured kobold, back to the fortress, and orders his men to find out where the enemy base is located. Sometime later, he continues managing his subordinates' improvements through the system, distributing Hutt's points between strength and speed, and becoming increasingly satisfied with how easily he can control the growth of his troops. Hutt reports that even after several threats and attempts at intimidation, no one has managed to get any information out of Model. Richard is not surprised and decides to handle the interrogation personally. The young shaman remains arrogant, threatens to turn the barbarians into insects, and even tries to use her supposed dragon bloodline to intimidate them. But Richard quickly makes it clear that he has no interest in her provocations. After taking a much more direct approach, Model finally gives in and reveals that her tribe is located in the mountains about 200 miles away. Richard also asks how many soldiers remain at the base, and she claims that nearly all of their warriors took part in the battle and were defeated, leaving only the elderly, women, and children in the settlement. Still suspicious, Richard makes it clear that she will have serious problems if she is lying, but Model insists that she is telling the truth. Richard then takes the opportunity to learn more about the magic used by the peoples of the wilderness. Model explains that there are many different types of shamans and that their abilities depend heavily on their origins. She herself possesses red dragon blood and primarily controls the fire element, specializing in flame magic. Shamans with bovine traits, meanwhile, can manipulate earth, causing landslides and opening enormous cracks in the ground, while troll shamans aligned with the wood element can control trees and vines to attack their enemies. This information makes Richard realize that the wilderness is far more dangerous than he had imagined. Now that he knows where the enemy base is located and believes that nearly all of its warriors have already been defeated, he decides to find Gunther and begin preparing a plan to attack the settlement. Before leaving, one of the barbarians asks what they should do with Model and the captured kobold. Richard replies that if the two of them are no longer useful, they can simply be buried alive behind the mountain. The threat works immediately and Model panics, claiming that she can still be extremely useful to him. To prove it, she reveals something she noticed when she arrived at High Mountain Fortress. The two enormous trolls Richard keeps in his territory are not ordinary creatures. According to Model, giant monsters of the wilderness can also produce shamans, and despite their crude appearance, some possess remarkable magical talent. She claims to have recognized special potential in the two trolls and assures Richard that if she is allowed to train them as shamans, they could become Asura shamans with far greater mana reserves than normal. 2 days after the battle, Richard has already begun transforming High Mountain Fortress into a true base. Part of the old structures is demolished while workers transport materials throughout the area, and Hutt confirms that the reconstruction is proceeding according to plan. Richard wants to reinforce the foundations and walls, in particular with large quantities of granite, because he knows that if he intends to face increasingly powerful threats, he must first make his territory much harder to invade. His goal is to completely rebuild the fortress and turn it into one of the strongest defensive positions in the wilderness. At the same time, Richard has not forgotten the information he forced out of Model. Since the shaman's tribe is based in the mountains about 200 miles away, he sends Hut to investigate the area with a small group of centaurs. For now, he has no intention of wiping anyone out. He only wants to confirm whether Model was telling the truth when she claimed that nearly all of their warriors had died. Richard also notices that Hut has become much faster after the improvements granted by the system, and the centaur herself remarks that her steps now feel so light that she could almost fly. Before she leaves, he simply orders her to return immediately if she encounters anything dangerous. While Hut carries out the mission, Richard decides to check the results of Model's training with the two trolls. After 2 days, the young shaman still seems irritated by how slow the creatures are, but she finally manages to awaken a special ability in one of them. During the training, the troll develops a technique that allows it to alter its own body and even disappear from the enemy's sight. Model explains that magical awakening depends on several different conditions, and that the second troll has still failed to manifest any ability. Richard does not consider invisibility particularly extraordinary, but he acknowledges that it still increases the magical power available within his fortress. At that moment, Annie appears again, accompanying another shipment of goods. Richard discovers that she is transporting large quantities of coal to trade with the dwarves, and finally asks why they need so much of it. Annie explains that the dwarves use coal to smelt iron ore and that, about 150 miles west of High Mountain Fortress, there is a dwarven territory near Lake Bayou. The previous year, they discovered large mineral veins in that region and have been buying increasing amounts of coal from the city ever since. Before Richard can think much further about it, however, an urgent warning arrives from the city. The message calls for the nobles scattered throughout the region to return as quickly as possible because a massive movement of the Bearmen tribe is advancing south and could put several territories in danger. Not long afterward, Hut returns from her mission much earlier than expected and arrives wounded. She confirms that she found no danger in the wolf territory or at the former shaman base, but on the way back, her group came across an actual battlefield covered with the corpses of dwarves. Strangely, only dwarven bodies were scattered across the area, with no clear sign of whoever had fought them. The situation only begins to make sense when signs of bearmen activity appear, matching exactly with the warning Richard has just received. With that, he realizes that the threat mentioned in the message is already approaching his region. Annie suggests that he temporarily abandon the fortress and return to the city with her, but Richard rejects the idea, believing that fleeing now would mean abandoning everything he has just built. He orders Hut to rest and decides to continue preparing. Since Annie's journey to the dwarves has probably become impossible, Richard takes the opportunity to suggest another destination for all that coal. Instead of taking it any farther, he wants to keep the shipment himself. Annie still tries to understand what he intends to do with it, until Richard reveals that he has already begun preparing his own weapons production inside the fortress. Gunther confirms that the equipment commissioned according to Richard's design is finally ready. He then takes Annie and Model to his new workshop and reveals the weapon he intends to use to strengthen the territory's defenses. Standing before them is a massive cannon, built from a concept Richard brought with him from his former homeland. Richard follows Hut to the place where the centaurs encountered the bearmen and quickly realizes the scale of the problem. The field is covered with corpses, and enormous footprints make it clear that a sizable force passed through the area. Hut explains that there were far too many enemies, and that some of the centaurs only survived because they fled in desperation. Richard recognizes that the improvements received by the clan, especially the increase in speed, were crucial to their escape. The group then begins searching the abandoned camp for anything useful. However, Gunther discovers that the bearmen took practically everything, leaving behind no food, money, or other valuable resources. Annie comments that these creatures are known for their cruelty and greed, but Richard believes there may still be something worth taking. Soon afterward, he finds several abandoned containers and is surprised to discover that they are filled with soy sauce. To Annie, it does not seem particularly valuable, since the dwarves commonly produce that kind of condiment along with preserved foods. Richard, however, becomes excited because it is the first time he has found soy sauce in that region and immediately sees a business opportunity. If he can use it in dishes and open a restaurant in the city of Coron, he believes he could attract nobles and create another source of income for High Mountain Fortress. Annie once again notices how Richard can turn even something seemingly insignificant into a business opportunity. Since night is already approaching, Richard decides to camp there. Rudo finds the decision strange, since their mission was supposedly only to investigate the enemy's movements, but Richard has no intention of returning before observing the bearmen personally. Later, Annie finally asks what he's planning. In her view, now that the bearmen army is marching south and clashing with the dwarves, the safest choice would be to simply keep their distance. Richard, however, has already realized the true reason behind the war: iron ore. He explains that resources like this are essential in a region dominated by conflict because whoever controls the raw materials needed to produce weapons gains an enormous advantage. Since the mines do not truly belong to either the dwarves or the bearmen, Richard sees no reason to simply stand by while the two sides fight over everything. Annie considers the idea extremely dangerous. This is a war on a much larger scale than any conflict Richard has faced so far, and a few dozen men could easily disappear in the middle of so many soldiers. Even so, he shows no intention of backing down and even invites her to take part in the venture. Richard points out that High Mountain Fortress is no longer as weak as it once was. His barbarians are more experienced, the centaurs provide ranged attacks, and Model has begun developing units capable of using magic. In his eyes, his current troops are worth far more than an ordinary army of the same size. Richard's confidence eventually convinces Annie, especially when he proposes splitting the benefits from the iron ore equally with her if the plan succeeds. The two reach an agreement, and Richard immediately moves on to the next stage. Returning to his men, he gathers the troops and announces that they will also enter the war, not only for the future of High Mountain Fortress, but for their own interests as well. Richard makes it clear that in the coming battle, his soldiers need to act as a force capable of completely breaking the enemy's resistance. Fired up, the men raise their weapons and prepare to march, while Richard begins making preparations to enter the struggle for the iron ore directly. Richard arrives with his group near the dwarven castle and quickly realizes that something is wrong. After carefully observing the area, he orders everyone to stop and remain alert. Hidden among the vegetation and water surrounding the fortress, several rabbit warriors are preparing to launch a surprise attack on the dwarves. Seeing this, Richard finds the situation strange. As far as he knows, the dwarves' main enemies should be the bearmen, so the presence of a rabbit force seems out of place. Annie, Hut, and Gunther explain that there is nothing unusual about it. Powerful races like the bearmen often form alliances and bring auxiliary groups into their wars. In other words, the rabbits are serving as support troops for the bearmen. Richard becomes annoyed that no one explained this earlier, while Model even mocks him for it and is immediately scolded. As they watch the invasion unfold, the rabbits quietly advance toward the fortress. One of them even mocks the dwarves, making it clear that their castle is being attacked by rabbit warriors. At the same time, inside the fortress, the dwarves realize that enemy troops are approaching the Lake Bayou region and immediately enter a state of battle readiness. The garrison hurriedly mobilizes to defend the fortress while the rabbits accelerate their assault. At that moment, Richard decides to act and orders a cannonball fired directly into the rabbit army. Richard's soldiers launch their attack while Richard and Gunther enter the fight against the enemy. In the middle of the battle, Richard realizes that the situation is more dangerous than it first appeared. While the fighting is still underway, the ground suddenly begins to shake as though an earthquake were starting. In the next instant, he understands the true cause of the tremor: the arrival of a gigantic bear man whose mere presence completely changes the balance of the battle. Richard clashes directly with one of the bearmen and immediately realizes just how dangerous the enemy is. Even though he manages to block the attack, he experiences firsthand the absurd strength of the bearmen and concludes that their power is truly terrifying. At the same time, the battlefield descends into chaos. The bearmen order everyone to attack together. The rabbits charge in large numbers, and the enemy troops attempt to crush Richard's group through sheer numerical superiority. On Richard's side, the centaurs answer with volleys of arrows, striking several enemies, but the rabbits still have reserve troops ready to join the fight. Seeing the situation growing more difficult, Model decides to act as well. Despite her reluctance, she admits that she needs to help and unleashes her fire magic across the battlefield. The sudden appearance of flames surprises the enemy, especially the bearmen, who complain that using magic is unfair. Meanwhile, the dwarves watch everything from inside the fortress. They are shocked by the strength of Richard's group and cannot understand who these unexpected allies are. The dwarven patriarch, Laubi, even begins to wonder whether the god of forging sent those people to protect them. One dwarf asks for permission to lead a team into battle and help, but Laubi refuses. In his view, the most important thing at that moment is protecting his own people, so he orders them to leave the battlefield to Richard and his companions. On the enemy's side, the bearmen try to reorganize their forces and order everyone to regroup. Richard, however, refuses to retreat. He decides to show them once and for all the power of the Lord of High Mountain Fortress. At that moment, he unleashes a devastating attack, creating an enormous tornado that tears across the battlefield and violently strikes the enemy. Richard takes advantage of the opening and charges forward again. He activates a new system ability, Power of Heaven. As soon as the technique takes effect, his sword becomes enveloped in intense blue energy, and he charges directly at one of the bearmen. The enemy barely has time to react before being struck by the blade, and Richard brings down another opponent as the system registers new rewards in experience and money. Satisfied with the result, he once again realizes just how much of a difference the Lord system is making in his growth. Meanwhile, Gunther continues pushing forward against the bearmen and clashes directly with one of them. However, the enemy's strength is enough to send her flying violently through the air, making the others believe she has suffered a serious blow. The bearman even thinks he has finished Gunther off, only to be surprised moments later by the protagonist, who is turned invisible. Richard then realizes that the technique can be shared with his allies and understands that an ability that initially seemed of little use can become extremely effective in battle. Gunther confirms that she is fine and explains that she was also able to withstand the attack thanks to the stone skin technique. Richard realizes that the abilities awakened in the trolls are not limited to the creatures themselves, since they can also be used to strengthen his companions. The advantage quickly shifts back to Richard's side, and Gunther already believes they are heading toward another complete victory. However, Richard notices something unusual happening among the enemy troops. A strange energy begins surrounding some of the bearmen, who start displaying a much more aggressive level of strength. Gunther identifies it as a form of berserker thaumaturgy, making it clear that the enemy also possesses methods for strengthening its fighters. Richard begins to suspect that these troops may be connected to the Crescent tribe, but the situation becomes even more complicated when new figures appear on the battlefield. In the southwestern region of the Pompeii Empire lives a powerful tribe of Tauran orcs, known for their rebellious and aggressive nature. Among them, certain shamans possess techniques capable of transforming and strengthening their warriors, making their minotaurs virtually unbeatable during a certain period. Because of their brutality and overwhelming strength, they became known as the Bloodhoof tribe. As Richard watches the enemies on the battlefield, he finds it strange that he has not seen any minotaurs casting spells directly. Model explains that those warriors are only partially berserk and believes that the berserker magic strengthening them was cast from a distance. Even so, Richard shows no concern. In his eyes, the remaining enemies are already broken and no longer have enough strength to face his troops in their current condition. With that, he orders his men to take advantage of the situation and keep pressing the enemy. The resistance quickly collapses, and the survivors begin to flee. Richard, however, stops his soldiers from pursuing the deserters. His real objective is not to exterminate every enemy on the battlefield, but to earn the dwarves' trust and secure a share of the iron ore from Lake Bayou. After driving the bearmen and their allies away from the region, Richard heads with Annie and the others toward the dwarven fortress. At the entrance, the guards immediately stop the group and demand that they explain their intentions before allowing them any closer. Richard introduces himself as Baron Richard, Lord of High Mountain Fortress and a noble of the Pompeii Empire. He explains that he came together with Annie of the Voya Trading Company specifically to help the dwarves fight the invaders attacking their lands. At that moment, Annie recognizes one of the dwarves at the gate and calls out to Robbie. As soon as he realizes that it really is her, Robbie finally lowers his guard and orders the gates opened. He apologizes for his suspicion and invites Annie and her companions inside. Annie then properly introduces Richard as the lord who came to help them. Even so, Robbie acknowledges that they were extremely lucky to survive the attack and thanks both the god of smithing and the newcomers for their assistance. Afterward, he leads everyone inside the fortress so they can talk more calmly. Once they are safe, Robbie admits that he also owes Richard his direct thanks for intervening, but he is surprised to see Annie returning at such a dangerous time. She explains that as soon as she and Richard heard about the bearmen invasion, they assumed the dwarves might not be able to hold out on their own and decided to come immediately. Robbie then abandons any remaining pride and admits that the situation is indeed critical. The dwarves are reaching their limit and do not know how much longer they can continue enduring the attacks. Richard suddenly laughs upon hearing this, making Robbie think he is being mocked. Richard quickly clarifies that he was not making fun of him, while Annie tries to calm the dwarf down and reinforces that Richard is a well-known warrior in Pompeii who truly came there to help the dwarven fortress. Robbie continues trying to understand how Richard became such a famous warrior. Imagining that he must have mastered some advanced form of cultivation or battle energy, he becomes even more confused when Richard admits that he has never trained in anything like that. He simply attributes his reputation to the enemies he has faced so far, leaving Annie to end the subject before the conversation drags on any longer. Since the threat of the bearmen has not disappeared, Annie asks what Robbie plans to do next. The patriarch believes the enemies will probably launch a counterattack and decides that, for the time being, everyone should rest before discussing their next moves. Richard agrees and asks for a place where his troops can spend the night. Since several stone buildings inside the fortress are empty, Robbie allows them to use the available houses. As they leave the hall, Annie asks Richard not to take Robbie's behavior personally. According to her, he is not usually like this, but the war and the pressure on his people have changed the way he acts. Richard, however, believes that showing so much desperation at a time like this damages morale, and even questions whether Robbie truly has the temperament required to lead. Annie thinks that judgment is too harsh and reminds him that not everyone can face war with the same calmness Richard displays. He admits that anyone would feel fear in the face of death, but believes the only way to win is to make the enemy feel even more afraid. After that, he tells Annie to get some rest while he also prepares to spend the night inside the fortress. Later, Richard's men try to settle into the dwarven houses, although the size of the buildings was clearly not designed for troops as large as them. Hut, for example, can barely get comfortable inside the room assigned to her and ends up deciding that sleeping outside might be better. At that moment, the entire structure begins to shake. Hut initially thinks it might be an earthquake, while Richard even jokes that perhaps the dwarves cut corners when building the house. However, as he feels the vibrations more carefully, he realizes that it does not seem like a natural phenomenon. The tremors grow stronger and stronger, coming from the heavy footsteps of something approaching the fortress. The dwarves immediately go on alert, rush to their defensive positions, and call everyone to the walls. Amid the commotion, Richard realizes that the dwarves are hurriedly mobilizing to face a much heavier frontal assault than the previous one. When Richard asks what the plan is for dealing with the minotaurs, the dwarves explain their traditional strategy. Since these enemies are impulsive, the idea is to lure them closer and then surround them all at once. They also point out that because the dwarves are much shorter, they can take advantage of the minotaur's enormous size, since the monsters have to bend down to hit certain targets effectively. Robbie then decides that Richard's troops should remain as a reserve force while the dwarves themselves try to hold the front line. The atmosphere among the defenders is tense, but Richard and his men remain almost absurdly calm. While the dwarves talk about the minotaur's cruelty and massive size, Richard even begins considering whether he might capture a few alive and sell them afterward, leaving the dwarves completely speechless at either the Lord's lack of common sense or his overwhelming confidence. Shortly before the direct clash begins, Robbie asks whether Richard still has any of those flaming projectiles he used earlier, but it quickly becomes clear that they cannot rely on them now. Instead, the dwarves check what remains in their arsenal and discover that they only have 6 heavy crossbows left. With the situation becoming critical, Robbie decides to use all of them against the advancing minotaurs, hoping that a concentrated volley can at least slow the initial charge. The enemies then launch their offensive. The dwarves wait for the right moment, allow the minotaurs to come closer, and fire the crossbows. Some of the bolts hit their targets, but the impact is not enough to stop the charge completely. Even while wounded, the minotaurs continue advancing brutally, showing that this new wave of attackers is far more dangerous than it first appeared. Robbie begins to believe that the dwarven defenses are about to collapse. Gunther also realizes that they will not be able to hold out like this for long and asks Richard what they should do. He admits that these completely enraged minotaurs are much harder to deal with than he expected, and immediately looks for the magic group, only to realize that Model has disappeared. Gunther then explains that shortly before, the young shaman noticed the situation was becoming dangerous and tried to flee, but the men managed to catch her and bring her back. Model still struggles to break free, and the protagonist asks how she dares to run when the enemies are right in front of them. She explains that the dwarves can no longer fight and that she is terrified. Richard points out that the minotaurs are being strengthened by berserker magic and reminds Model that she also has a spell capable of increasing the ferocity of anyone affected by it. Robbie immediately assumes that she should use the magic to help the defenders, but Richard surprises everyone with a completely different order. He wants Model to cast bloodlust on the enemy minotaurs themselves. Robbie cannot understand it. After all, those monsters are already completely enraged, and applying another strengthening spell would only increase their combat power even further. Model even asks whether Richard has gone insane, but he stands by his decision and demands that she simply do as she is told. With no other choice, Model begins casting the spell. The energy surrounds the minotaurs and intensifies their berserk state even further, making their bodies even more violent and powerful. To everyone watching, Richard seems to be strengthening the very enemies who are already threatening the fortress, leaving even his own allies unable to understand what he hopes to accomplish. Model continues casting bloodlust on the minotaurs while Richard orders her not to stop and to speed up the spell casting. The magic keeps accumulating on the enemies and makes the warriors even more violent, causing the dwarves to panic. To them, Richard appears to be strengthening monsters that were already almost impossible to contain. Model also believes the plan is going to get everyone killed, but Richard tells her to stop complaining and watch carefully. What no one realizes is that he has no intention of overpowering the minotaurs through sheer strength. The larger and more powerful a body becomes, the greater the strain its organs have to endure. Berserker magic had already pushed the Minotaur's physical attributes far beyond normal limits, placing enormous pressure on their bodies, especially their cardiovascular systems. By adding even more power through bloodlust, Richard simply intends to push that strain past the breaking point. Soon afterward, the results begin to show. The Minotaurs start losing control of their own bodies and one after another collapse across the battlefield. The system immediately registers the experience and coins earned, while Robbie and the other dwarves cannot understand how Richard managed to defeat those monsters without even fighting them directly. Richard then explains that despite the Minotaur's incredible endurance, even they have limits. Berserk had already placed their bodies under extreme stress, and bloodlust became the final push needed to exceed that limit, causing severe internal damage. In the end, the very physical strength they were so proud of became the cause of their defeat. He also reveals that he first suspected this possibility when he saw one of the Minotaurs drop to its knees after receiving the initial Berserker enhancement. From that moment on, he realized that the magic placed a heavy burden on the body and deliberately decided to increase that pressure even further. Robbie is impressed by his reasoning, while Richard sums it up by saying that strength pushed to an extreme can also become an extreme weakness. Model tries to use the moment to remind everyone that the spell responsible for the result came from her, but Richard does not let that slide. He has not forgotten that the shaman tried to run away when the battle became dangerous, and he criticizes that behavior directly. She abandons the battlefield when faced with a powerful enemy, then shows up to claim credit as soon as victory is guaranteed. In Richard's eyes, Model's experience dealing with small tribes in the wilderness will not be enough for what he intends to build at High Mountain Fortress. After the battle, Robbie confirms that the Minotaurs really are dead. Richard believes the internal damage caused by the overload killed all of them, and even regrets that he could not capture a few alive to sell to the Colosseum. Even so, with the bear men and Minotaurs defeated one after another, he believes they should have a few days of peace. Richard, however, does not expect that calm to last very long. In his view, the next attacks will probably be even more violent, which means the Dwarven fortress needs to improve its defenses immediately. While examining the massive bolts used by the heavy crossbows, he confirms with Robbie that both the projectiles and the weapons themselves are made from ore mined around Lake Bayou. With the Lord system on his side, Richard believes that the longer he can prolong the war, the stronger his troops can become. The ore can be claimed later. For now, his priority is keeping the dwarves from being wiped out. Because of this, he suggests that Robbie quickly manufacture more bolts and additional heavy crossbows for the upcoming battles. Robbie has no problem producing more ammunition, but hesitates when Richard mentions the crossbows. Before he can explain why, another dwarf approaches and asks Richard to follow him, saying it would be better for him to see the problem with his own eyes. Robbie takes Richard to one of the fortress workshops and shows him why they cannot produce more heavy crossbows. Inside, Richard finds an enormous crossbow made almost entirely of steel, far more advanced than anything he expected the dwarves to possess. Robbie explains that the tribe had ancient bronze tablets containing records of this type of construction and that he merely reproduced the design. The weapon has enough range to accurately hit targets from hundreds of paces away. Richard immediately realizes that by adding a proper sighting system, they could make the shots even more effective. With several of these crossbows concentrating their fire on the same target, even extremely durable enemies would have difficulty withstanding the impact. However, Robbie reveals that the real problem is not the range or the weapon structure, but the bowstring. Traditional sheep tendons cannot withstand the enormous tension generated by the steel limbs. To solve this, the dwarves would normally need rare giant Monaka leeches, whose bodies are incredibly strong and flexible. Once dried and processed, they can be turned into strings durable enough for this type of weapon, but the dwarves cannot find any at the moment. Richard finally understands why those crossbows were not used, even when the fortress was on the verge of destruction. Thinking of an alternative, he remembers that the centaur's bows use Komodo dragon tendons. If several of those strings are braided together, they may be able to temporarily replace the Monaka leeches. The solution seems workable, but Richard immediately points out another problem. He is practically broke. Robbie then reveals that the fortress still has a considerable amount of gold coins accumulated from past trades involving hides and ore. The moment Richard hears this, he drops all pretense of restraint and tells them to bring as much gold as possible so he can purchase the necessary materials. The dwarves themselves begin to question his intentions, realizing that Richard clearly has personal interests in this war. Even so, they acknowledge that without his intervention, the fortress would probably have already fallen. To some of them, Richard may be their last hope of victory, so the resources are gathered to put his plan into action. Even with a temporary solution for the bowstrings, Robbie remains worried. If another large enemy force attacks, the improvised material may not hold up for long. He admits that his fear goes beyond simply losing a battle. The war has already lasted about half a month. Nearly half the fortress's inhabitants have been killed or wounded, and the dwarves simply do not have the strength to endure another series of battles on that scale. Richard then proposes a much more radical alternative. Since the entire war appears to have started over control of the iron ore, they could temporarily abandon Lake Bayou and allow the other tribes to fight among themselves for the region. Once the enemies had worn each other down, the dwarves could return and reclaim the territory with far less difficulty. Robbie rejects the idea immediately and makes it clear that abandoning the lake is out of the question. His reaction catches Richard's attention and he asks why they would risk so many lives for nothing more than an iron mine. Pressed for an answer, Robbie finally admits that the dwarves are not protecting only the ore. His response makes Richard realize that something far more important is hidden in that region. He begins to suspect that beneath the waters of Lake Bayou, the dwarves are guarding a secret they have not yet revealed. Inside the dwarven fortress, the existence of Lake Bayou's true secret sparks an argument among the tribe's leaders. Some dwarves completely refuse to reveal anything to Richard, arguing that it is far too important to share with an outsider. Others point out that although Richard clearly has his own interests, it was thanks to his help that the fortress survived the recent attacks. Robbie understands the elders' distrust, but he also recognizes that the war is still far from over. The dwarves themselves have already suffered too many losses and are unlikely to withstand another powerful enemy force on their own. Because of this, even against the wishes of some members of the tribe, he decides to place their final hope in Richard and ends the meeting, determined to reveal the secret. While that decision is being made, Richard observes another result from Model's magical training. One of the trolls manages to awaken another ability, but he considers the new spell rather useless and complains about all the effort spent just to obtain something like that. Annie reminds him that ability awakenings are unpredictable, and that a technique that seems useless at first may prove valuable later, just as Stoneskin and Invisibility did. Richard accepts the argument and simply tells Model to keep training the trolls because he wants to turn High Mountain Fortress's magical group into a truly powerful force. Not long afterward, Richard is finally taken to the true secret guarded by the dwarves. They travel to the lake and, with the help of a special device, descend through a hidden passage deep beneath the region, where they discover a massive creature chained inside the mountain. As soon as he gets a better look at the gigantic figure, Richard realizes that he is not looking at a simple monster, but an ancient titan. Richard finally understands that the iron ore was merely a way to conceal what the dwarves were truly protecting. The presence of the titan explains why the tribe refused so desperately to abandon Lake Bayou even after suffering such heavy losses. To make matters even more astonishing, the creature seems to react to the dwarves' approach, and its eyes begin glowing for a few moments, showing that it can still sense the presence of those around it. Back on the surface, Richard admits that he had imagined they might find a gold mine or some other rare resource, but he never expected to discover a titan hidden beneath the region. Robbie explains that it all began when the dwarves were mining near the lake and accidentally discovered a fissure inside the mountain. When they explored it, they found the creature imprisoned deep underground. Richard then asks why the entire tribe would risk its survival merely to protect a titan. Robbie reveals that this creature is not just any titan. According to dwarven tradition, it is an ancestor of their race. The revelation leaves Richard completely stunned, especially because of the enormous physical difference between the gigantic titan and the small dwarves of the present day. Robbie, however, shows no doubt whatsoever. He draws attention to the glow in the creature's eyes and explains that it appears whenever the titan's spiritual power senses dwarven blood nearby. When the light appears once again, Robbie makes it clear that this connection is more than a legend to his people. The titan shares the same bloodline as the dwarves, and to them it is not merely a distant ancestor, but a true divinity that must be protected at any cost. In the ancient stories, Su Xin is described as a magical creature whose status even surpassed that of dragons. During the Mordecai era, its existence was regarded as a symbol of power. The Titans, meanwhile, mastered creation magic and were considered the true rulers of the land, but not even creatures that powerful could escape the passage of time. As the ages went by, the Titan population began to decline until they disappeared from the world entirely. After hearing all of this, Richard asks why the dwarves did not simply flee with the Titan when the war began. To him, crossing those mountains should not be impossible. But Robbie explains that the situation is not that simple. The iron ore in that region produces a special magnetic field, capable of keeping the ancestor's soul power concentrated in its eyes. If the Titan is removed from there, that power may end up dissipating. Richard remains skeptical and says, there is no proof that the ore can truly keep the Titan's soul from dispersing. Robbie replies that he can prove it. When they first found the ancestor, the red light coming from its eyes was much stronger. However, as the dwarves continued extracting ore from the area, the light gradually began to weaken. Because of that, the tribe recently banned iron mining in that location. Understanding the situation, Richard asks whether they intend to keep protecting the Titan until they all die. Robbie explains that it is not quite like that. They discovered that during a full moon, the Titan's soul power can manifest even when no one is standing near it. Moreover, the fuller the moon becomes, the stronger that energy grows. One of the elders adds that the night of the full moon is precisely when the Titan's power can reach its peak. The tribe's ancient books also state that this soul power can be inherited. If someone manages to receive it, they could gain enough power to face any enemy. Richard understands their intention and asks whether the dwarves are trying to inherit the Titan's soul power. Robbie confirms it, but admits that they have already tried several times and never succeeded. The elder then reveals that he made calculations together with Renault and discovered that the moon on the following night will be the fullest of the entire century. Because of that, they believe it will be their best opportunity to perform the ritual and attempt to inherit the Titan's power. Richard finally understands why the dwarves are so desperate to keep protecting Lake Bayou. Even so, one thing still bothers him. If this power is so important, why tell him everything? Richard asks whether they are not afraid that he might also become interested in the soul power. Robbie replies that this energy represents the final glory left behind by the Titans. To the dwarves, it would be worse to let that power disappear forever inside the cave than to allow someone else to inherit it. The elder also reveals that they have already discussed this among themselves. If the dwarves fail again, Richard will also be allowed to try receiving the power. The protagonist finds the idea absurd. If even the Titan's own descendants failed after so many attempts, he sees no reason for a human to get involved in this mess. However, the elder believes Richard may have a chance because of his physical strength. Richard remains unconvinced. In his view, soul and body need to be compatible, so someone of the same bloodline should have a much better chance of succeeding. Robbie simply laughs and admits that his reasoning also makes sense. Since they have already spent too much time there, Richard suggests that everyone return before someone notices anything unusual. Before leaving, Robbie asks him to keep everything secret and, above all, not tell Annie anything. Richard promises that he will not say a word. In fact, he also needs to get back quickly before she begins to grow suspicious about his disappearance. When he returns to the fortress, Gunther immediately asks where he has been and why he is completely soaked. Richard makes up an excuse that he accidentally fell into the lake and orders one of the men to bring him a towel. He then asks why Gunther is there and where everyone else went. She explains that Annie went to watch Model train the trolls and that Hut and the others went along as well. Meanwhile, Richard can only hope that the dwarves manage to remain safe until the night when they attempt to inherit the Titan's soul power. However, shortly afterward, Hut comes running over and warns that something bad has happened. Richard asks whether she found anything, and the centaur reveals that an enemy army is advancing toward them from about 70 miles away. Richard asks how many enemies are coming. Hut replies that there are approximately 4,000 or 5,000 soldiers. Hearing that number, Richard realizes that the enemy truly has no intention of stopping until they get what they want. And with the full moon arriving the very next night, everything suggests that another major battle will take place at the exact same time the dwarves intend to perform the ritual. With the enormous enemy army drawing closer, the dwarves rush to prepare the fortress defenses. The heavy crossbows are positioned along the walls, and Robbie can only pray for the protection of Hephaestus, the god of the forge. On the enemy side, the Bear King looks toward the dwarven fortress and makes it clear that he intends to conquer it before sunset. The moment he gives the order, thousands of beastmen and minotaurs begin advancing. Robbie laments that the attack had to happen at this exact moment. If they could hold out for just one more day, the dwarves would be able to perform the ritual during the full moon. If someone managed to inherit the Titan's soul power, perhaps they would no longer need to keep fighting like this. Richard notices the patriarch's discouragement and tells Robbie to pull himself together, reminding him that he is still responsible for leading the entire dwarven fortress. Meanwhile, the Bear King orders his troops to continue advancing. Sendak sees that the enemies are already approaching and commands the dwarves to prepare to receive them. Richard waits until they enter the weapons range and finally gives the order. The heavy crossbows fire all at once at the approaching army. Several enemies are struck, but that does not stop the rest of the troops from continuing forward. Soon the two sides clash, and beastmen, minotaurs, and dwarves begin fighting in front of the fortress. Model also joins the battle and launches her fire magic at the enemy. Explosions tear through several parts of the battlefield, creating openings among the advancing troops. With the enemy line already engaged in combat, Richard decides to leave the defensive position and orders everyone to follow him. He charges directly across the battlefield and soon encounters an opponent very different from the rest. Richard realizes that this bear man is probably the Bear King himself. Without wasting any time, the two immediately clash. The Bear King attacks Richard and manages to hit him, surprising even Gunther. Richard feels the blow and admits that it has been a long time since anyone managed to injure him. The Bear King has no intention of stopping and charges again, declaring that he will take Richard's life. Richard counters and the two continue fighting head-on. However, the enemy leader is not the only problem. Gunther notices that the other fighters are also behaving like madmen. Even after taking blows and suffering serious injuries, they continue advancing without any fear of death. The battle drags on, and for the first time, Richard begins to suffer real losses among his own men. The system registers the casualties. One of the Class 1 warriors is killed in battle, while several barbarians and other soldiers are seriously wounded. Others are still able to continue fighting, but they are injured as well. Richard becomes furious when he realizes that this is the first time High Mountain Fortress's troops have suffered a death in battle. To him, these enemies clearly came prepared to fight to the very end. Unwilling to keep taking casualties like this, Richard changes his strategy. He orders Gunther to tell Hut to use the archers to cover their retreat. Back at the Dwarven fortress, the situation continues to deteriorate. Several dwarves groan in pain and call for help, while Robbie despairs when he sees Sendak in that condition. Richard has no patience for crying at a moment like this and scolds Robbie. He tells him that, as patriarch, Robbie needs to take responsibility, gather the soldiers who are still alive, and continue fighting until the full moon arrives. Shortly afterward, Richard bids Sendak farewell and tells him to rest in peace. Annie then asks what the situation is, and Richard replies that the city is already under siege. Outside, the sounds of slaughter are so loud that even an elf's ears would easily be able to hear them. Meanwhile, the dwarves try to hold the entrance to the fortress, but the enemy pressure only continues to increase. At the same time, other troops climb the walls using ladders and manage to invade the city. Model rushes back and warns Richard that the situation has become critical, and that the enemies have already taken the fortress. Richard is surprised by how quickly they broke in, and asks why they did not use the fireball spell. Model explains that with the rain coming down so heavily, the fireball technique barely works at all. Richard then asks about Gunther, Hut, and the others, but he soon realizes that their situation is also bad. When he finds Gunther, Richard asks whether she is alright. Gunther says she is, but admits that not even the stone skin technique was enough to stop the enemy advance. Richard then asks Robbie how many dwarves are still left, and Robbie replies that only 100 remain. Hearing this, Richard concludes that each of them will have to face around 10 enemies. Without wasting any time, he first orders them to break up the enemy formation and calls everyone to charge together. Richard then charges into battle alongside his men. He cuts through the enemy line, taking down several opponents, and his offensive even catches the Bear King's attention, prompting him to immediately order everyone to focus on killing the Pompeian first. Even while surrounded, Richard keeps advancing and unleashes a wide-reaching strike that clears space across the battlefield and knocks down several enemies at once. Gunther is impressed by her leader's strength, and Richard arrogantly replies that they only deserve to witness that kind of power once. Even so, the overall situation remains critical. Gunther soon warns that the dwarves no longer seem capable of holding out much longer. Hearing this, Richard realizes that the defense is close to its limit and immediately decides to resort to another option. He calls Model over and orders her to use Bloodlust. Richard tells her to cast the spell immediately, and as soon as the magic takes effect, the dwarves begin to feel its effects. The protagonist then orders the rest of the magic group to use everything they have available. Even so, the enemies continue advancing, and the dwarves keep fighting to prevent them from taking over the fortress. The Bear King then orders his own men to charge as well, determined to wipe everyone out in one push. Richard has been waiting for exactly that. He orders one of the trolls to block the passage, and the shaman causes enormous trees to erupt from the ground, completely sealing off the path of the enemy troops. Realizing that he has been separated from his men, the Bear King understands that he has fallen into a trap and curses Richard. Seeing that the enemy leader is now isolated, Richard remarks that things have just become much easier. He then orders the troll to use the invisibility technique and takes advantage of the cover to slip through the blockade unnoticed. Waiting on the other side is none other than the Bear King. He still looks down on Richard and treats the boy's life as worthless, but the protagonist is already preparing to end the fight. Richard strikes the Bear King before he can react. The Bear Man barely understands what happened, while Richard simply bids him farewell as he collapses dead to the ground. The moment the soldiers realize that their king has died, the entire army begins to panic. The enemies abandon the battle and try to flee, while the allies take advantage of the chaos to pursue those still nearby. Richard watches the rout and realizes that all it took was for their leader to fall for the rest to completely lose their will to fight. After such a long battle, the Dwarven fortress finally survives. However, the victory comes at a heavy cost for Robbie and his tribe, who lose many men during the fighting. For Richard, though, the battle also brings several gains. The system begins registering the advancements of his troops. Jarvan and 31 other Class 1 barbarian warriors advance to Class 2. Another 23 soldiers reach level 3 of the Frenzied class. Gunther and 4 other fighters advance to Class 1 Frenzied warriors. 17 Centaur guards also rise to Class 2, while Model advances from Beginner Shaman to Intermediate Shaman. Looking over all those advancements, Richard realizes that High Mountain Fortress has just taken another step forward. Later that night, Robbie comes to greet him. Richard finds it strange to see all the dwarves dressed so formally and asks where they are planning to go looking like that. One of the elders then reminds him that this is the night of the full moon. They intend to perform the ceremony once again and attempt to inherit the Titan's power. Only then does Richard remember the ritual. Robbie explains that even though the war ended only recently, this opportunity is far too rare to waste. Because of that, they have chosen the strongest warriors in the tribe and are prepared to try again. With the fullest moon of the century shining above them, Robbie can only hope that their ancestors will finally bring good fortune to the tribe and allow one of the dwarves to inherit the Titan's power. The magic group finishes draining the lake and the dwarves descend to where the Titan is imprisoned. Once everything is ready, Robbie announces that the inheritance ceremony can begin and calls forward the first candidates. Before attempting to receive the power, the dwarf performs a small ritual using a kind of rod. Richard watches without understanding a thing and comments that it looks more like someone swatting away flies. Model explains that it is only meant to ward off bad luck and probably does not even serve any real purpose. Still skeptical, Richard asks whether this whole idea of inheriting power actually works. Model says she has never witnessed it herself, but there are records of shamans being able to pass part of the experience they accumulated throughout their lives to their descendants. Richard thinks the story sounds exaggerated. If it were truly possible to transfer everything at once, shamans would not be treated as inferior to mages. Model agrees and explains that no one can inherit all of someone's experience. At best, only a portion can be passed on. That makes much more sense to Richard. Even if someone received a large part of the previous generation's knowledge, whatever was lost during the transfer might take an entire lifetime to recover. Then the ritual truly begins. The dwarves use their blood connection to call upon the power of the great Titan. Richard asks Model whether it could be dangerous. She says yes. The soul energy carried by a Titan is far too powerful for a dwarven body, and if the candidate cannot withstand it, their body could even explode. Richard is relieved that he is not the one receiving that energy. One candidate tries and fails. Another is called forward, followed by another. One by one, they all fail. Robbie begins to despair. After so many unsuccessful attempts, he begs the Titan to show mercy to its descendants. The elders also realize that it appears to be over, and that no one in the tribe has managed to inherit the power. With no other option, Robbie looks at Richard and asks him to try. Richard reminds him that he is not even a dwarf and sees no reason to involve himself in this. But Robbie keeps insisting. After thinking about it for a moment, the protagonist agrees to try just to put an end to the insistence. Trying to remember what the others did, Richard steps into the circle and imitates the ritual movements. Even he thinks he is doing everything carelessly. Yet this time, something actually happens. Energy erupts around Richard inside the circle, and the Titan reacts for the first time. The protagonist stares in disbelief and even wonders whether the ritual actually worked, considering that he is not a dwarf of any kind. But the Titan's reaction continues to intensify. When Richard realizes that the giant is beginning to release an absurd amount of energy, his expression changes completely, and he tells everyone to run because it looks like the Titan is about to explode. A small white creature emerges from the Titan's body. It makes a few strange sounds and immediately draws everyone's attention. Richard realizes that the little creature seems to have some connection to Titans and giants, even though its appearance looks nothing like them. The dwarves immediately treat it as a little ancestor. They rush after it to keep it from falling and warn everyone that no one is allowed to harm it since it represents the legacy left behind by the great Titan. Richard watches all the commotion while Model suggests simply cooking the creature and eating it to find out whether it can increase someone's power. The dwarves panic just from hearing her say that. After taking a closer look at the little creature, Richard notices a membrane connecting its arms to its body. Judging by its structure, it can probably use it to glide. Sure enough, the creature uses the membrane to leave the Titan and fly directly toward the trolls. However, the protagonist catches it and begins examining it more closely, eventually realizing that there is something unusual about it. The dwarves become excited and ask if they can hold it. Suddenly, the little creature releases an electrical discharge. The moment Richard notices it, he tosses the creature toward the dwarves. Richard is surprised when he realizes what just happened. The creature truly inherited the Titan's lightning magic, confirming that it received part of the power left behind by the giant. At that moment, Robbie notices something else and tells everyone to look at the Titan. After passing on its legacy, the giant's body begins to crumble away. Robbie understands that the ancestor has finally completed its last mission, and that the time has come for its body to return to the earth. The small creature watches the titan disappear and once again lets out its strange chikyu sound. Richard then decides that from that point onward it will be called huo chikyu. Afterward, the group begins the journey back. Annie asks why Richard is in such a hurry to return to High Mountain Fortress when they have not even finished discussing the terms of their cooperation involving the dwarves. Richard tells her not to worry because once everything is settled, Annie will receive the share that belongs to her. However, the answer does not convince the elf. Annie directly asks whether Richard and the dwarves are hiding some secret from her. Richard senses the danger in the question, but quickly denies it and tries to act as though nothing is going on. At that moment, Annie finally notices Huo Chi-Q in his arms. Her attention shifts completely and she becomes fascinated by the little creature. Richard explains that the dwarves originally wanted to keep Huo Chi-Q and raise it themselves. The problem is that the little creature simply refused to stay away from him. Since it would not even eat whenever Richard left its side, the dwarves eventually allowed him to take the creature with him. During the journey, Richard still has to take care of his new companion and tells the little one to drink less, because at that rate it will soon end up peeing everywhere. A few days later, Richard, Annie, and the others return safely to High Mountain Fortress. Annie then leaves with the merchants, promising before she goes that she will bring people back as quickly as possible to officially begin establishing trade relations with Richard's territory. The protagonist waits several days for her return, but Annie never appears. Instead, the person who arrives is Soren, the head of the court. Richard welcomes him and remarks that it has been quite a long time since they last met. Soren replies that lately he has been hearing Richard's name everywhere. According to him, even the bards in the city of Korum are already singing stories about his exploits. Richard asks whether Soren was simply passing through the region, or if he came there for a specific reason. Soren replies that he made the trip especially for him. Richard finds the answer strange, and asks whether he really traveled all that way just to see him. When Soren confirms it, Richard stares at him for a few seconds, and thinks that the visit seems far too suspicious. He then makes it clear that he is not particularly interested in men, but Soren tells him to stop talking nonsense. The court chief has brought some rare ingredients and suggests that they talk over a meal. Richard agrees and soon discovers that Soren's supposed delicacy is grilled squid. While eating, Huo Chi-Q starts bothering him again, so Richard gives him some of the food. Soren notices the little creature and senses some kind of elemental energy coming from it. He asks whether it is a magical beast, but Richard explains that Huo Chi-Q is a survivor connected to the Titans. Richard then hands over a reward and tells someone to call a cook. He also explains that despite Huo Chi-Q's small size, the creature inherited one of the purest Titan bloodlines. Soren starts laughing at the story. Richard does not bother trying to convince him and says he can believe it if he wants. The conversation then turns more serious. Richard takes the opportunity to thank Soren for all the help he has received. Ever since he began developing his territory, the court chief has made many things easier for him, and his journey probably would not have gone so smoothly without that support. Soren realizes what Richard really wants to know. After receiving help for so long, he finally wants to understand the reason behind it. Soren then reveals that for years there have been two major factions within Pompeii. Richard asks what they are. One faction supports the Church of Holy Light and wants Pompeii to become increasingly aligned with its influence. The other prefers to preserve the tradition tied to the goddess of ice and snow and does not want the Church of Holy Light to gain too much power within the empire. Soren explains that the Church of Holy Light is currently the dominant religion among humans. Its influence is so great that nearly 1/3 of all countries have some reference to the word holy in their own names. Pompeii is different because it lies at the far northern edge of human territory and frequently suffers from snowstorms and cold-related disasters. Belief in the goddess of ice and snow has become far stronger there. After understanding the situation, Richard asks whether Soren and his half-brother Wenger belong to opposing sides of this struggle. Soren denies it. He explains that mages generally do not believe in gods. Because of that, he considers himself a secularist and remains neutral between the two factions. Richard notices that Soren is using some kind of powder and comments that mages usually do not smoke either. Soren explains that it is not tobacco. It is a powder made from the brain marrow of giant beavers. Since mages tend to have weaker bodies while putting enormous strain on their minds, he uses it to relieve his migraines. Richard then reveals that he does not believe in gods either. As far as he is concerned, there has never been any concrete proof that a true god has ever descended into that world. Because of that, blindly believing in something that may not even exist makes no sense to him. Soren says that he investigated Richard a long time ago and already knows this. People who follow no deity at all are extremely rare in that world, and it was precisely this similarity between them that made Soren decide to help him. Richard is stunned to discover that this was one of the reasons behind all the assistance. Soon afterward, he realizes another possibility and asks whether Soren intends to pull him toward the neutral faction. Soren admits that the idea has crossed his mind. Richard immediately refuses. In his view, when major factions start fighting, anyone who tries to stay in the middle ends up getting hit by both sides. Soren even admits that there is some logic to that. Even so, he says that if Richard is ever forced to choose a side, it would be better to support the Church of Holy Light. Richard asks why. Soren then places gold, silver, and copper coins used in Pompeii on the table. He explains that one gold coin is worth 12 silver coins, while one silver coin is worth 24 copper coins. Richard realizes that the system is unnecessarily complicated, especially considering that humans only have 10 fingers for counting. He then understands that Pompeii could have changed those ratios to simpler numbers long ago, but never did because of religious influence. The goddess of ice and snow is depicted with 12 wings and 24 messengers surrounding her, so even the monetary system ended up following those numbers. Soren confirms that the Church of the Goddess of Ice and Snow has far too much influence over Pompeii. While he explains this, Richard takes advantage of a distraction and pockets one of the coins from the table. Soren notices immediately and asks whether someone with Richard's reputation really needs to take advantage of him over a single coin. Richard replies that he does because he is still poor. To him, even the smallest amount is still money, and besides, he still owes Soren gold coins. With that new coin, Richard updates his debt to 1,001 gold coins. Soren can only curse his shamelessness. When it is time to leave, the protagonist asks whether Soren truly intends to continue down that path. Soren asks whether Richard is doubting his decision, and Richard admits that he is not, although he thinks the court chief does everything rather arbitrarily. Richard also thinks that it is not as though he intends to remain trapped in High Mountain Fortress forever. Soren says that he heard about how well the territory has been developing, and therefore set aside several official matters to make the visit. Richard remarks that his position really does come with plenty of privileges, if Soren can simply show up whenever he wants. Soren replies that such privileges belong to old men like him, and that Richard does not need to be jealous. As a pioneering lord, there is still a much larger world waiting for him to explore. Richard asks whether Soren regrets never choosing that path, but he says he does not. To explain, he reveals that he is mildly allergic to the giant beaver brain marrow powder. Whenever he uses it, his neck starts itching, but in exchange, his terrible migraines disappear. To Soren, life works the same way. Every choice brings both a loss and a benefit. What matters is deciding which consequence is more worthwhile to endure. After that, Soren continues on his journey. Sometime later, Model runs over to Richard to tell him that Annie has finally returned. When she arrives, Annie is surprised by what she finds and even asks whether this place is really High Mountain Fortress. Richard jokes by asking whether she no longer recognizes it, and Annie admits that the territory has changed so much since she left that it is almost unrecognizable. Richard explains that much of the transformation happened thanks to the two troll generals. Lately, they have been spreading the land fertilization technique everywhere, causing the region around the fortress to become covered in grass and wildflowers. Privately, Richard finds it amusing how completely such a power clashes with the troll's rough appearance. Annie soon notices another change. Many dwarves are now living in the territory, including men, women, elderly people, and children. She asks where all of them came from. Richard explains that the warriors of the dwarven tribe suffered enormous losses during the war. Because of that, after everything that happened, the most natural solution was to bring the rest of the tribe to live at High Mountain Fortress. Annie immediately suspects that Richard had some secret agreement with the dwarves. He denies it and assures her that everything was only decided after she left. However, Annie notices something else and asks what Richard is doing at that moment. Surrounded by several girls, Richard becomes awkward and tries to explain himself. According to him, after the war, several tribes were nearly wiped out and many people were left with nowhere to go. Since all of them came to High Mountain Fortress of their own free will, he simply could not bring himself to refuse them. Soon afterward, he shifts all the blame onto Model and says it was her idea to choose some of those girls as maids, since they had no one else left to rely on. Annie decides not to continue arguing and says that she also brought someone to introduce. The visitor is Miss Buckland, a well-known naturalist. Buckland greets Richard, but the first thing he notices is her feline features, prompting him to ask whether she belongs to the tiger people. Annie explains that Buckland comes from the famous White Tiger clan, but is much more devoted to the arts and scholarly pursuits than to fighting. Buckland herself says that her nickname is Sugar, and tells Richard that he can also call her Tang Bai Hu. Richard tries repeating the name and finds the resemblance to another name from his previous life amusing. He never expected to encounter that kind of wordplay in another world. Annie explains that Buckland wants to conduct research on the nature and species of the wilderness, using High Mountain Fortress as her base. Richard agrees without any problem. As far as he is concerned, at least she does not seem like someone who will consume many resources. Not long afterward, another group prepares to leave the fortress. Gunther informs him that they are ready to depart, and Richard tells everyone to go and return as quickly as possible. If the trip goes well, he also wants them to bring more tribal natives back to live in the territory, although he warns them not to overdo it. Gunther promises to gather as many people as she can. Richard also asks them to search the market for advanced battle energy manuals. Annie says she can look but advises him not to get his hopes up. Truly valuable items of that kind are rarely something that can be purchased with money alone. At that moment, Robbie comes looking for Richard. Richard notices how exhausted the dwarf looks and tells him to take better care of himself instead of working himself to death. But Robbie has come specifically to deliver good news. The new blast furnace is finally complete and the blacksmiths are already preparing for the first smelting. With the dwarven tribe now living at High Mountain Fortress, Richard has access to a large number of experienced blacksmiths as well as plenty of ore to work with. From that moment onward, High Mountain Fortress's military industry finally begins to get on track. Gunther returns to High Mountain Fortress after spending several days away and is impressed by the amount of new equipment throughout the territory. One thing in particular catches her attention: an enormous suit of armor. Richard appears and asks what she thinks of it. Gunther says it looks far too expensive and wants to know what it is for. Richard explains that the armor was specially designed by Robbie. To put it on, all he has to do is press a button, and the entire set rapidly locks itself around his body. Richard calls the invention speed armor, and even asks whether it does not look stylish. Gunther laughs and remarks that Robbie even came up with an intimidating name for it. When she asks for the official name, Robbie awkwardly replies that it is the Titan Iron Armor. Gunther loves the name. The problem appears immediately afterward. Richard realizes that he cannot remove the armor by himself and asks everyone for help. Gunther finds that strange since it is supposed to be speed armor. Robbie explains that it is fast to put on. No one ever said it would also be fast to take off. While everyone is trying to free Richard from the armor, a soldier arrives to report that several lizard men are waiting outside and want to meet him. Richard immediately asks for a telescope to see who they are. After observing the group, he is disappointed by their appearance. To Richard, those lizard men look far too small and weak to have any military value. The soldier explains that they did not come to fight. They claimed that they were simply passing through the region and decided to pay a visit. Richard cannot understand why they would do that. Gunther thinks it would be better to capture all of them for questioning in case they are hiding some ulterior motive. Hutt tells Gunther to calm down and says that too much impulsiveness is a sign of brain atrophy. At that moment, Buckland notices something important. The group is probably traveling to Pompeii. Richard asks what lizardmen like those would possibly do there. Buckland explains that for many years, Emperor Sagres has recruited powerful races from the wilderness and granted them citizenship. Richard still does not see the connection. As far as he is concerned, those skinny lizard men are nowhere close to looking like a powerful race. Annie warns him not to underestimate them. Their people are known as the Scar and are also nicknamed dragon tamers. The moment Richard hears the word dragon, his expression changes completely. Annie immediately cuts off his excitement and explains that they do not possess actual dragons. The creatures accompanying the Scar are dragon-like beasts known as Scar Prairie Earth Dragons. Richard complains that Annie only revealed the interesting part after getting his hopes up. Buckland then explains that Scar biology is rather unusual. Every birth produces both a lizard man and an earth dragon at the same time. Because of that, calling them dragon tamers is not entirely accurate. The lizard man and the earth dragon are blood relatives, rather than having an ordinary relationship between trainer and beast. Richard immediately becomes curious about which of the two creatures is actually responsible for reproduction. Buckland explains that the earth dragons are naturally born incapable of reproducing. In practice, they can be considered a byproduct of the Scar reproductive process. Richard puts that question aside and asks what actually matters to him. How large are those earth dragons? Buckland replies that they are only slightly smaller than Richard's iron-eating armadillo. They also have hoofed legs and are not especially good at charging attacks. That is already more than enough for Richard. He immediately orders his men to chase after the visitors and insists that they must spend at least one night at the High Mountain Fortress. Buckland asks what he intends to do. Richard answers without hiding his intentions. He wants to keep that group of Scar at High Mountain Fortress. Buckland thinks the idea is absurd. According to her, it makes no sense for those people to abandon the opportunity to serve a king in favor of following a pioneering lord whose future is still uncertain. Yet, sometime later, Richard is already calmly talking with one of the lizard men. He tells the visitor to go back and bring all of his people to High Mountain Fortress. The lizard man agrees and begins addressing him as Lord. Buckland can hardly believe it. To her, the situation was resolved far too quickly. Richard simply replies that if it is up to him, there is no reason it should fail. Buckland becomes suspicious and asks what Richard gave those people. According to her, not even a little girl would be convinced that easily. Richard insists that he did nothing special. He merely told them that he possessed a kind of magical potion capable of increasing their strength and promised to help the Scar if they agreed to remain at High Mountain Fortress. The moment they heard that they could become stronger, the group wasted no time and decided to join the territory. Buckland clearly does not believe such a simple explanation. After that, the days pass and Richard begins waiting for the Scar to return. Sitting inside the house, he plays cards to pass the time. First, he announces a 3. Then, he plays a 2. But his attention remains focused on the arrival of the new group. The moment he notices movement outside, Richard becomes excited. What he already considers his future invincible Inquisition Earth Dragon troop is finally arriving. Gunther asks Hut whether the centaurs would be able to hold them off in battle. Hut replies that those creatures are too large and that, from a distance, they would have difficulty reaching the centaurs. Richard observes the group and realizes that the Earth Dragons are practically natural heavy cavalry. To him, they are a perfect match for his future Supreme Lord Earth Dragon troop. Annie thinks it is a shame that the Scar are so skinny. According to her, it would be even better if stronger warriors rode the dragons. Richard says replacing the riders would be easy. The problem is that the trust between the Scar and their mounts exists because of the blood bond between them. Buckland explains that the same natural advantage granted to the Scar also comes with a limitation. Every birth produces both a Scar and an Earth Dragon at the same time. This makes pregnancy far more difficult and very few women survive childbirth. Because of that, their population grows very slowly. Soon afterward, the group's leader introduces himself. His name is Abu, and he is the chief of the Scar people. Richard asks what he thinks of High Mountain Fortress. Abu replies that the place seems very prosperous. Richard then tells Abu to gather all of his people and promises to give them the potion he mentioned. Abu thanks him. At that moment, Richard discovers another unexpected advantage. Since the Scar and the Earth Dragons share a blood connection, the system also recognizes their mounts. This means that when the Scar level up through the potion, the Earth Dragons can evolve alongside them as well. Afterward, Buckland mentions that Annie told her Richard was searching for a new martial cultivation method. Richard asks whether she knows one. Buckland replies that she does not have what he is looking for. Even so, she recommends the Holy Word prayer technique. Richard is familiar with the technique. It primarily trains mental power and combines it with the body to release greater strength. The problem is that the method gradually fell out of use over time. Because of that, Richard considers the technique outdated and shows little interest. Annie agrees that nowadays the Holy Word prayer technique really is regarded as something ancient. Buckland criticizes that way of thinking. In her view, young people today either worship old things too much or simply discard everything that comes from the past. She then asks how powerful Richard's current punch is. He tries to remember and estimates that it is close to 2 tons. Buckland asks whether he knows the true effect of the Holy Word prayer technique. Richard tells her to stop dragging it out and explain already. She reveals that the technique directly increases the user's strength. Richard still does not find that particularly impressive. Only then does Buckland explain the important detail. The increase is proportional to the strength the person already possesses. Richard finally understands. This means that the stronger the user already is, the greater the boost they receive. And that is not the only advantage. After reaching a certain level, the technique also greatly increases resistance to magic. Buckland explains that during her travels, she managed to obtain the first stage of the technique's manual. When Richard receives the scroll, he recognizes the name Nero and remembers that he was a swordsman known for training in both magic and martial arts. Buckland explains that 3,000 years ago, there was a period known as the Hidden Era of the Great Elemental Tide. At that time, cultivating magic and combat techniques was extremely difficult. Since the Holy Word prayer technique relied very little on elemental energy, it became one of the main methods of that era. Nero was a great practitioner of the technique, and even managed to develop his magic until reaching the level of a mage. Richard immediately realizes that the scroll cannot possibly be the original from 3,000 years ago. Buckland confirms that no scroll could survive for that long. It must simply be a copy made by later generations. After handing over the method, Buckland takes the opportunity to make another request. She asks whether Richard would allow her to handle the internal affairs of High Mountain Fortress. Richard agrees without hesitation. He admits that the territory's internal administration is still poorly developed. Having someone with Buckland's knowledge take charge of that area would be exactly what the fortress needs. Buckland is pleased. To her, High Mountain Fortress is growing at an incredible pace and possesses a vitality she cannot find anywhere else. After observing everything Richard has built there, she admits that it has been a long time since anything impressed her so much. Buckland finally concludes that she truly likes High Mountain Fortress. Richard begins studying the Holy Word prayer technique and realizes that it is quite simple. The method has 5 major stages: sunlight, starlight, moonlight, radiant sun, and apocalypse. The first stage already allows the user to activate the technique for half an hour each day and increases strength by 50%. With every advancement, both the duration and the power increase double. Even though Richard understands the theory, he knows he needs to test it in practice and decides to begin training. Not long afterward, he manages to form the technique's initial symbol and is impressed by his own speed. An ordinary person would need about a month to reach that point. Now he only needs to condense the warm current he feels inside his body into a small energy core around his heart. Once he does that, he will officially enter the sunlight stage. Richard even considers training through the entire night to complete the process, but decides to leave that for later and first opens the system panel. That is when he realizes the system has already recognized the Holy Word prayer technique. Richard immediately thinks about spending his free points to improve the technique. The problem is that he has been saving those points for a long time and knows they are becoming increasingly difficult to obtain. Even with constant training and several difficult battles, the total still increases slowly. He hesitates for a few moments before giving up on saving them. Richard decides to spend the points and accelerate his progress all at once. The system informs him that he has reached the critical training level after consuming 30 free points. At that very moment, Richard feels the change. Near his heart, the energy begins compressing until it forms something resembling a tiny sun. It is the core required to sustain the Holy Word prayer technique. Power begins circulating throughout his body, and Richard also notices that his eyesight has improved. He can now see details that previously escaped his notice. The changes do not stop there. Even the air around him feels different, and Richard senses that he can make better use of the energy naturally present in the environment. Only then does he understand why Buckland recommended the technique so strongly. It is highly compatible with his body and the strength he already possesses. Excited by the result, Richard even begins considering spending his remaining points to keep advancing. When Buckland sees him afterward, she is surprised and believes Richard managed to make progress in only a single night. Excited, she even calls him incredible. Richard immediately convinces himself that everyone will notice his advancement and be amazed by his talent. Soon, Hut, Gunther, and Robbie arrive and simply greet him as usual. Richard finds it strange that none of them notices any change in him. He then tries to tell Buckland that he has already managed to form the energy core. Before he can finish, she misunderstands him and asks whether he has already finished reading the manual. She then tells Richard to begin by trying to condense the warm current described in the technique. Realizing that no one has any idea how far he has already progressed, Richard can only think that he is surrounded by a bunch of country bumpkins. Richard is still annoyed that no one noticed his advancement when Robbie arrives with another issue and asks what they should do with the bronze weapons that keep piling up in the warehouse. Buckland asks what weapons he is talking about, and Richard remembers the relics they obtained from the wilderness tribes. Among them is even an ancient sword that, judging by its ornamentation, appears to date back to the time of Nero's rebellion and could be worth a considerable amount of money. Buckland asks to see the items, and Richard goes with her, already thinking about the profit he could make if there really are more than a dozen valuable pieces. But when he reaches the warehouse, he finds an enormous quantity of bronze weapons and realizes that this is far too strange to be mere luck. Richard knows that ancient bronze should not appear in such huge quantities. The high prices of these artifacts exist precisely because they are rare. Buckland examines the weapons and also notices something wrong. Besides being extremely well preserved, they still carry the smell of soil. In her opinion, they probably came from an ancient tomb or an old military arsenal. Richard immediately begins thinking that he has struck it rich and orders someone to summon Model. The moment she arrives, she immediately starts defending herself, insisting that she did not steal Second General Heng Hai's milk. Richard ignores the excuse and warns her that from now on, he asks the questions and she answers them. He shows her the weapons and asks whether Model had ever seen those items when she lived with her tribe. She confirms without hesitation. Richard then begins asking where they came from, when they appeared, and how many there were. Model explains that about half a year earlier, she obtained those weapons through a neighboring tribe to the east. At the time, several tribes bought the same type of equipment because it was much cheaper than iron weapons. Richard is outraged that she never mentioned something so important. Model does not understand his reaction. To her, those weapons are nothing but junk and are not even much better than the equipment produced by the tribes themselves. Richard tries to calm himself and concludes that Model simply had no idea how valuable they were. He then announces that he has an important mission for her. Richard assigns 10 soldiers to Model and orders her to discover exactly where those weapons are coming from. She even asks whether she can refuse, but Richard makes it clear that she should never have asked that question in the first place. Model leaves with the 10 men in search of the origin of the artifacts. After all the battles they have won, High Mountain Fortress's reputation has already spread throughout the region. Among the local peoples, Richard's group has become so famous that many practically go out of their way to please them as soon as Model appears. Since the bronze weapons circulate openly among the tribes, she's able to follow the clues until she discovers the source of the relics. The problem is that by the time she returns, her small team has somehow turned into a group of several hundred people. When Richard sees so many people approaching, he almost thinks High Mountain Fortress is under attack again. Buckland notices that the group comes from many different backgrounds, and that it would not even be easy to determine which tribe each person belongs to. Richard solves the problem in the simplest way possible. He gives each of them a sickle and orders everyone to cut grass to feed the livestock. Afterward, Model shows him roughly where she found the ruins. Richard realizes that the area is enormous and decides he cannot leave the investigation entirely in her hands. He orders them to choose a reliable guide and prepare several dozen men because he wants to investigate the site personally. Richard is already thinking about the potential profits from the discovery as well. The fortress needs enormous amounts of food because the earth dragons eat constantly and seem like bottomless pits. Before leaving, he orders the rest of the group to return to their homes and continue protecting High Mountain Fortress. A week later, Richard finally returns. Annie notices the approaching caravan and Buckland asks how the investigation went. Richard replies confidently by asking whether there is anything he cannot accomplish. The amount of ancient weaponry he brings back is so enormous that Annie warns that dumping all of it onto the market at once could completely crash the price of those relics. Buckland then notices that the rabbit men did not return with Richard and asks where they stayed behind. Richard explains that he found a beautiful mural inside the ruins. Because of that, he left the rabbit men there trying to figure out a way to remove the entire painting from the wall intact. Buckland asks whether he is not worried that something might happen to them. Richard sees no reason for concern. In his mind, no one would have any reason to attack a group of rabbit men working alone in a place like that. At the same time, the enormous amount of bronze artifacts beginning to circulate throughout the region attracts the attention of another force. The person who receives the information is Hendra Gurnavinton, commander of the Brown Bear Roar Army of the Kingdom of Stuart. After following the clues, Hendra arrives at the location and confirms that they have finally found the ruins. Guys, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new content. Thank you.